In a remarkable exercise spanning 15 years, the last survivors of the Great War were interviewed on film. These are unique stories of courage, sacrifice, and tragedy, told by the men who were there. These extraordinary interviews have been brought together for the first time. This six-part series begins in 1914 with the wave of fervent patriotism that accompanied the outbreak of war. It was an euphoria that would soon be shattered, lost in the shell-torn landscapes and water-filled trenches that spanned the Western Front.
More than once you could hear the whiz of a shell going past. Chap on my right, I was speaking to him about something, and then I turned to this fellow, I turned back again. You're missing. One of those shells, straight at him. He was missing.
It made you never forget it, never, and I haven't to this day. Just to think you shot a man, you know, and do nothing at you. That's how we were on, young and daft.
These are the last voices of World War I. In the summer of 1914, 3 German armies under the command of Kaiser Wilhelm II marched into Belgium en route for Paris. Belgium's neutrality was guaranteed by Britain, and the Kaiser was given a swift ultimatum to withdraw or face the consequences. When that ultimatum expired, Britain declared war on Germany. Units from Britain's regular army were quickly mobilized for action, and the British Expeditionary Force set sail for France. Public confidence in a swift and decisive victory was high. After all, in 1914, Britain remained a world power. Her Royal Navy was the envy of the world, and the British Empire still spanned a quarter of the globe. The patriotic belief in king and country was often instilled in young men at an early age, and Britain's rich military history meant many were prepared to fight and die for their country. 19-year-old Londoner Richard Hawkins had been an officer cadet at school, brought up to believe in the importance of duty and empire.
This country ruled the British Empire, and the British Empire ruled the world. And it was a very, very different place. I mean, we were the best country in the world, the best everything in the world. We were all very proud of ourselves. And as a young man, it was my duty, and the duty of every young man, to go and defend it against all invaders, and to give, if necessary, our lives to do it.
If public confidence was high, there were some within the British government who remained more realistic, not least the new Secretary of State for War, Lord Kitchener. Sensing a long and drawn-out conflict, Kitchener appealed for 100,000 new recruits through the now iconic poster, informing every fit and able man in Britain that he was needed by his country. Seeing the opportunity to escape from a mundane job and embark on a daring adventure in France, many thousands rushed to join up. Insurance clerk Robbie Burns from Glasgow was 18 at the outbreak of war, and amongst the first wave of new recruits to answer the call to arms.
Everywhere you went in Glasgow, the great big posters up of Kitchener with his finger pointing at you. No matter where you were, this finger seemed to be pointing at you. Your king and country need you. However, I worked in an insurance office, and now and again, I could hear the piper in the left, right. And I went to the window, I could see probably 200 or 300 men, some with bowler hats and some with what we call skips, that is flat caps. And the pipes always seemed to do something to rouse my enthusiasm. I thought to myself, well, I want to do something like this. I never thought of being killed. Never thought of that. And I thought it'd be good fun killing somebody.
Such was the success of Kitchener's campaign that recruiting stations across the country were quickly swamped with volunteers.
Name?
Kitchener had no trouble in finding the first 100,000. Damaged you couldn't get into the Ruddy Army. There was such a rush to get there, to get on, and defeat the enemy and prevent him from taking over this country.
Are you a British subject? Yes.
It was our duty, nothing out of the ordinary. It was obvious.
But as the ranks of Kitchener's new army began to swell, the patriotic volunteers had no idea of the horrors they were about to witness. After the outbreak of war, the number of new recruits to Kitchener's army rose swiftly. Meanwhile, in Europe, German forces continued their ruthless march towards Paris until on the 23rd of August 1914, they met the advancing British Expeditionary Force at the Belgian town of Mons. After an intense and bloody battle, the overwhelming size of the opposition forced the BEF to retreat. The Germans followed, turning their attention away from the French capital in the hope of destroying the retreating British army. As news of the BEF's gallant retreat reached Britain, the recruitment rate soared again as a new wave of patriotism swept through the country. Idealistic young men like 20-year-old shoe repairer Jack Rogers from London joined up, determined to prevent the Kaiser's forces from reaching England.
Blinking old Kaiser and his son, we used to hate them people, but we certainly wanted to, get out and do our bit because we thought they might be taken over here, you see, and we didn't want that to happen. So we'd do anything that's to fight, of course, and keep them from coming here. And I went up to this place at Shepherd's Bush where we joined on, and they gave me then the choice of, 3 different regiments I could have been in. The third one was the old Sherwood Foresters, 7th Battalion, and they were called the Robin Hood Rifles. So I fancied that. I thought I'd like to be a Robin Hood Rifle.
Across the country, men were encouraged to enlist with the promise that they would serve alongside friends and work colleagues in so-called PALS battalions. Civic pride meant that towns and cities competed with one another to attract the most new recruits, and new battalions were formed made up of men from the same street, factory or football team. 18-year-old Ted Francis left the paper factory where he worked and joined the 16th Warwickshire Regiment, known as the Birmingham Pals.
You'd have thought that an extra bank holiday had been told in Birmingham because people were excited, laughing, joking. Young people like myself were saying, we'll show those Germans, we'll push them back home. How dare they walk over little Belgium, etc., etc. And we were anxious to get to France, to have a go at them, to push them back into Germany.
Fearing the worst, many parents tried to convince their sons not to enlist, but most young men saw war as an opportunity too good to be missed. In County Durham, 18-year-old farm worker George Littlefair's mother pleaded with him on her deathbed not to join up.
She says, there's a war on now. You'll know it, says I. She says, do not join the army. That was her last words to me. And what did I do? Join the damned army. It was more or less a novelty to you, you know. Well, we've never been out to England, we've never seen out. We were raw country lads and never seen out. Aye, that was how we felt. We weren't down long before we were learning, I'll tell you.
By the winter of 1914, almost 1 million men had joined Kitchener's army. Meanwhile, across the Channel, it was becoming clear that there would be no swift victory. Both sides had begun to dig defensive positions in the frozen fields of France and Belgium, and a system of fortified trenches emerged, which would eventually spread from the Belgian coast to the Swiss Alps. The age of trench warfare had arrived. At home, new recruits were so plentiful that the army only selected those in A1 physical condition. They were desperate to join the action, but would first have to endure a period of rigorous training to turn them from civilians into soldiers. For many of the volunteers, this period of training was a welcome relief from the daily grind, and much like the scout camps of their youth. Outdoor activities in the open air soon replaced the factories, mines and shipyards many had left behind, but they quickly learned that it wasn't all fun and games. Army discipline could be harsh and punitive. Robbie Burns from Glasgow had just turned 19 and was doing his best to stay out of trouble.
If you did things wrong and you lose your pay, which is a lot of money, shilling a day, don't forget that. Yes, and you lose your leave. You have to do extra drill and keep reporting to the guard room at certain times. So it paid to do what you're told to do, and I always did that, always.
Slope! Arms! Order!
For the youngest volunteers, this was often their first time away from home and their mothers, something the sergeant majors didn't let them forget.
Platoon!
He wasn't very old himself, but he was a big, tall young fellow, but he got a nasty wagging tongue, and he used to call us all you flippin' little mother's boys and all that sort of talk, you know what I mean, and used language that we never liked at all. He used to use swear language too, and we used to absolutely dislike this fellow when he came and took over. I suppose in a sense it did you good. You got to know what discipline meant.
But this volatile mixture of men from different social classes could, on occasion, turn nasty. Farm labourer George Littlefair took great offence at a comment made by a young corporal.
Platoon!
When I was 19-year-old there, I was 12 stone 2 pound. On the rough country lad, I didn't get a damn for none of them. Aye. There was one little bugger, wax tash, turned up, and yapping and shouting. And he used to call me Liquor Fair, because he was short too, and he couldn't get Little Fair. And I was in one of them good humours, I never answered him. So he come up, Timmer. He looked at him. Who the hell do you think you are? And I just stood. He said, I think you're a bastard. Ooh, as soon as he said that, I hit him in the mouth with that. No, I said, don't prove it.
George was fortunate. For striking a corporal, he could have faced a court-martial. But he was spared punishment when he revealed to his commanding officers that his mother had recently died. Taking command of an over-enthusiastic bunch of new recruits could be a daunting prospect for an inexperienced young officer. After first enlisting as an infantryman, 19-year-old Richard Hawkins was granted a commission into the Royal Fusiliers and responsibility for his first platoon.
And why the hell they did as they were told by a young man, probably younger than they were, I don't quite know, except that they were told that I was in charge of them and I was the officer and they got to do as they do, and they did. No question of it. The morale was tremendous. We were anxious to get on with the job. We wanted to go to France and stop this nonsense. And we were all, I think, very proud to be in the army, defending our country for the people to come after us.
With vast numbers taking up arms, there were often shortages of equipment, and many volunteers learnt to drill with makeshift weapons, broomsticks and shovels. Finally getting to use a rifle was a great thrill.
Came the great day when we was issued with rifles. Now, we was all waiting for that. And if I'd seen myself and some of them who rubbed that rifle and cleaned it and they worshipped. And even the more thrill was to, when we had real bullets to fire at a target. That was really something we'd all look forward to.
You had to learn how to use a gun. You used to go on musketry courses, and you had to pass out different exams on these courses before you became a qualified rifleman. And so I got to be, as it happened, quite a good shot. And I became eventually what they called a marksman. And so for which I got an extra £6 a day on my wages. Used to get an extra £6 a day if you were a qualified marksman, which I was.
Kitchener had expected his new recruits to undergo a year of training before being sent into action, but two major factors meant that this period was cut short. Firstly, during the spring of 1915, the Allies suffered enormous casualties on the Western Front. In just 2 days of fighting, 11,000 men were lost for a gain of just 2 kilometres when British and Empire troops launched their first major offensive of the war near the French town of Neuve-Chapelle. Worse was to follow, as a further 70,000 men were killed or wounded fighting to defend the Belgian town of Ypres, where the Germans used poison gas for the first time to devastating effect. Then in April, the Allies attempted to open up a new front with the launch of the Gallipoli campaign in Turkey. In the months that followed, over 140,000 British and Empire troops would be lost on Turkish soil in one of the most infamous battles of the war. But for now, this deployment of fighting men to the east, combined with heavy losses in the west, meant that the new recruits were needed in France urgently. And in May 1915, the first divisions of Kitchener's army began their journeys to the front line. One of those preparing to go to France was 18-year-old George Louth from Hampshire. He had lied about his age when he'd enlisted and was given one last chance to avoid the fighting.
Because my captain sent a sergeant out to me. He said, Louth, he said, the captain wants to know how old you are. I said, why, Sergeant? He said, because he don't believe you. He said, we're going to France, he said, and we don't want you crying when you get over there. Say you're not old enough. He said, because it won't happen. You won't come back. So say it now. I said, I'm going with the lads. And from then on, we went on.
By the time the new recruits began to arrive in France, an uneasy peace had settled over the Western Front. Attack and counter-attack had done little to gain either side an advantage, and the dangers of shell fire and machine gun bullets kept both sides confined to their trenches. As they marched towards the front, Kitchener's men knew little of the horrors that awaited them and remained confident that victory would soon be theirs.
You could see some of them swelling absolutely fist and bust themselves with pride. And I, too, to be cheered by French and mostly girls too. Thought it was great to be a soldier then. We'll show them, we'll push these Germans back where they belong, etc., etc. And it was just the thoughts of really young men who didn't know any better.
No, I felt a real man then. Watching behind the pipe with knowing going to do something. I felt really well, no fear whatsoever. We were all happy. We'd start singing. Oh yes. No, there's no unhappiness about, because at that time we hadn't been in the front line trenches or reserve trenches. We didn't know what the war really was. You could probably hear a very, very faint noise of gunfire, very, very faint. And then the nearer we got, of course, to that, then we realised what we're in against. Then I began to shake then. Yeah, I began to shake then the nearer we got to the front line.
When we went up, it was pouring with rain. We're just on foot walking up to marching, as it were, laden right up with all our equipment, all you could carry, you know, everything on, and bent up with your guns, you got everything on you. And suddenly you begin to see the sky lighting up, flashing, 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 and you begin to hear the noise of the guns. You know, you're getting nearer, you're getting nearer. You can't help feeling butterflies in your tummy. Whether you were going to shoot Germans or whether they were going to shoot you, you never knew what the future held. That was a terrible thought, really. Going into war is not a very pleasant experience. Terrible.
And in the weeks and months that followed, the men of Kitchener's army would learn the dreadful realities of trench warfare, where the possibility of death or serious injury was only a gunshot away. In May 1915, the first divisions of Kitchener's new recruits arrived on the Western Front. Many had been waiting for this moment for months, desperate to do their bit for king and country. But as they moved up to the trenches, men like George Louth saw for the first time the true horrors of war.
When we got there, first thing we noticed was dead horses on the ground. We had to crawl over them dead horses that had been shot dead or the shells dropping over. And we knew then what it was like. We used to see the lights night time and the flashes of the guns, but we knew what we were going into then.
However, there was still a reckless naivety amongst those excited by the prospect of war.
And then, of course, you get in the front line, the first thing you want to do is where are the Germans? You put your foot up in the fire step, which might be 18 inches or 2 feet up, and somebody said, sit down, you silly bee, you'll get shot. We still wanted to look over and see where the Germans were.
Tragically, these innocent young men were quickly baptized into the fragility of life in the trenches.
The great sensation was the first man in the company to be killed. It kind of sobered us up, and in another day or two, 2 or 3 was killed or wounded. And it all came to our minds, this was no outing, this was real. And a German sniper really only wants a few seconds of your head and you'll get a bullet.
More devastating than the sniper's rifle was shell fire. Both sides' ability to rain terror down upon the enemy from a great distance changed the face of modern warfare forever. More soldiers were killed or wounded by the shrapnel discharged by an exploding shell than by any other weapon. It was a deadly fact of life that the new recruits had to learn to endure.
They're sending their shells over, we're sending the ours over, and you got that noise all day long. Day after day, for weeks. If you wanted to talk to one another while a bombardment was going, you'd have to shake pretty loud when a bombardment's going, because there's thousands of guns going off at the same time, and they keep it up.
Well, at times it's indescribable. You could see the trench mortars coming over, great big thing like that with a sort of 2-foot handle on it, looked like that from it's up in the air. You could see it coming, going up from going up, and then you could see it coming down. If it's coming, you think it's coming towards you, you run to the left or run to the right. And if you're lucky, you miss it. If you're unlucky, well, you're gone.
Jack Rogers was lucky to survive when the trench he was in received a direct hit.
One of the great big shells, however big it was, I don't know, landed right on the earth above us and exploded. And all of a sudden, of course, all the earth above us all suddenly collapsed and came right down straight on top of us, absolutely as we were sitting there, buried us just completely alive. It covers right in. And I knew I must have been struggling hard to breathe. I couldn't move. I couldn't move hand, foot, only my toes in my boots.
Jack was eventually pulled from the earth by his colleagues. It was a miraculous escape. Throughout the summer of 1915, further divisions of Kitchener's men arrived at the front. As well as the risk from snipers and shell fire, living conditions in the trenches were often uncomfortable, to say the least. During periods of heavy rain, mud and water in the trenches could be ankle deep, and they teemed with vermin who ate into rations and fed on rotting corpses.
When the rain came down, it would just stay there, and you'd be walking about in mud. And then when that dried, you can guess the condition of your feet or your legs, particularly to those who wore a kilt. If the mud would work up onto the bare knees, it was pretty painful at times when the mud dried and the hairs were rubbing. It was pretty painful.
More annoying for soldiers in the trenches were the lice, which lived in the seams of their uniforms and the warmth of their body hair.
I'd been on sentry go for 4 hours, and the officer says, you're off for 2 hours now, and if you can find a dugout, he says you can have 2 hours sleep. After my 2 hours sleep, which I enjoyed very much, I felt itchy. And I started to stretch myself in various places, and I was covered with lice. And I was horrified. More than anything then, I was absolutely horrified.
Well, you know, there wasn't a man in the trenches but war wasn't lousy. You know, when I was on night duty, I used to get paraffin out of a damn tilly lamp. Rub myself all over with paraffin. I killed the buggers, see?
Living in such terrible conditions, the men relied on the close friendships they formed with their colleagues to help them through.
Well, they were all together for the first time. Where do you come from? What did you do? What did you work at? Any cigarettes, you've got a light, you've got a gasper. And they're all friendly. You married? No. Any girls? Oh, yes, half a dozen. Yes. Yes, very friendly. Right through the war, doesn't matter where you went, you came across a soldier, you were friends right away. And you give them all you had to give. Whatever they wanted, you gave them if you had it.
Closest of all were the bonds made between men in the PALS battalions. Often these men had grown up together in the same town or village, or had worked together before joining the army. George Littlefair from County Durham had volunteered together with his best friend from home.
I had a pal in the army, and we were the best of pals together, and they called him Joe. We had our ups and downs between us, but still we were always good pals with one another. We helped one another. If he had no writing paper and wanted to write a letter, and I had it, he got it, or a pen. We were all like that.
The officers too had a responsibility to uphold morale, and as Richard Hawkins found, the army regulation tot of rum often did the trick.
I went round with the rum bottle every morning at dawn, round the trenches. And the tot was 1/8 of a pint. And I said, I'm going to exaggerate, but you could feel that rum going down into your boots, which were probably full of icy water, drying up the water, coming up to you and looking over those, and now where's that r.i.p? It saved lives. It was old Navy rum until supplies ran out, and then we got ordinary rum by Joe. There was a lot of difference. But that old Navy stuff, one would have taken on of the whole of Germany at dawn in the morning. And I don't exaggerate about that.
The sending and receiving of mail also played a vital role in maintaining morale. Although letters were often censored to ensure important military information didn't fall into the wrong hands, the men were permitted to write about their frontline experiences. Many wrote graphic accounts of the tedium and horror of trench life, while some were encouraged to pass on only good news for the benefit of their loved ones.
I wrote a letter to Mum. I said, same old thing, bully beef and biscuits. So the officer came out to me, he said, Dave, he said, what's this you've got on here? Bully beef and biscuits, he said. He said, can't you say you had roast beef and baked potatoes? And I said, I can't tell him what I haven't had, sir.
Whilst it was heartwarming to receive good news from the folks back home, it could be equally devastating to learn of the death of a family member or of a spouse's infidelity. Jack Rogers was upset when his mother wrote to tell him that she had seen his girlfriend Elsie out with other men.
I was upset. You just, realise what the position you're in. You don't know what to do. You don't know if the stories you're hearing are true. They're coming from my people, and telling me just what has happened. I could only believe them, of course, which I had to.
Fearing the worst, Jack wrote to Elsie with a proposition.
I wrote to her, to my home, when I heard about different things, and asked her would she stay, and I'd try and get home and we'd get engaged to be married. She never answered it, so I never heard from her anymore.
For all the harsh conditions, the most terrifying prospect that awaited soldiers in the front line was the launch of an attack, and the sight of men going over the top would become one of the defining images of the Great War. While some welcomed the opportunity to at last engage the enemy, rushing headlong towards a German trench through a deadly fog of machine gun bullets and shrapnel was frequently their final act. Whether a man lived or died in these attacks was often down to pure chance, but there were those who had their own tactics for staying alive. Ted Francis went over the top with his brother, Harry.
When you're waiting at a certain time to go over the top, you hear the officer blow a loud whistle. And that's the time that you're supposed to scramble and get over the top and dash for the nearest shallow. But Harry and I, on the sound of the whistle, we didn't jump up and get over. Those that did were mercilessly cut down by machine guns and killed, wounded. But we waited till the machine gun had passed our trench and then dashed over quick. And that, in a good many instances, no doubt, saved us from being killed or wounded.
You didn't do anything bloody daft. You know, I'm a British army, and that style, you didn't do that. You went over very quietly. Well, there's a bit shelter, you took it. Aye. Aye. Sergeant will shout, get down, get down. Aye. You go down. You'd get in the back of a bloody thistle if you for shelter.
You just had to lie as flat as you could. Don't lift your head up when you're lying flat. Lie down as low as you could. And then when the shelling stopped, go forward a bit. You're not on the parade ground when you're over the front. The parade ground, you've got to be so many inches away from each other. But when you go over the top, you can't measure that. Some can run faster than the others.
For those that survived the treacherous dash across no man's land, there followed the terrifying prospect of brutal hand-to-hand fighting as the attackers attempted to capture the enemy's front-line trenches. But even at close quarters, most men preferred to rely on the bullet rather than the cold steel of the bayonet.
Is it either him or thou? And he was standing solid where thou was on the move. Aye, thou just pull the trigger and down he would go. Aye. It made you never forget it. Never. And I haven't to this day. Just to think you shot a man, you know, and do nothing at you. That was how I used to always look at it. And then again, he was say, well, if I don't get him, he'll get me, and my life is worth a hell of a lot to me. That's how we were on, young and daft. Aye.
As autumn approached, the Allies needed a victory and planned their first truly concerted effort to break through German lines near the French town of Loos. It would be the first real test for Kitchener's men. On the 25th of September 1915, the Allies launched their first major attempt to break through the German lines. 72,000 men lined up along a 7-mile front near the French coal mining town of Loos as artillery fire bombarded the German positions. The regular army would be the first into action, followed closely by the new recruits. It would be the first major battle for the men of Kitchener's army. Robbie Burns was one of those who went over the top that day. He got close enough to the German lines to see them loading shells into their guns.
And the guns would fire almost straight at you. Bang, 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 bang. It's not the question of bang and away all up 2 or 3 miles, not like that, but those guns, well, bang, bang, just like that. And actually, they went more or less straight at you, More than once you could hear the whiz of a shell going past. Chappie on my right, I was speaking to him about something. And then I turned to this fellow. I turned back again. He was missing. One of those shells, straight at him. He was missing. Then I turned to this fellow on my left. I said, Bill's gone. And I turned to this fellow, lying there, down.
By the end of the day, the Allies had broken through German lines, but problems with supplies and communications meant that their advance could not be consolidated. After 3 days of fighting, they were forced to retreat back to where they'd started. British casualties totaled around 20,000 men. The Battle of Loos had been a failure. It also highlighted a major flaw with the concept of PALS battalions, as for the first time, scores of men from the same village, town or factory fought and died alongside one another. The impact on life at home was devastating. George Littlefair experienced just this kind of loss. As he went over the top, he saw his best friend Joe hit by shrapnel.
I knew what had happened, and down he went and groaned, and that was it. I'd get on, because another wave was coming behind us. If I'd had time to do it, to lift his head up and try to talk to him, that's what I would have tried to do, but no good. He had to keep going. Either that or he'll get trampled on. We've not even said so long to one another. Aye.
"1915 had been a year of radical change for the British Army on the Western Front, as it adjusted to a new kind of warfare. It would have to rethink its tactics if it was to win, and that would inevitably mean the sacrifice of countless more young lives. Throughout the ranks of Kitchener's army, the new recruits mourned lost colleagues. After more than 80 years, Ted Francis remembered off by heart a soldier's poem, paying tribute to lost friends.
Where we went to, nobody knows. And it wasn't like the fighting, as you see in picture shows. We had days of hell together, till they told us to retire. And Spottish flow language set the water carts on fire. But him and me were very lucky, for 2/3 of us were dead. With their screaming black Mariahs and the shrapnel overhead, but every time they missed us, and their fire was murderous hot. I'd Spotty shout, "Encore, encore." I said, "What's that?" He said, "That's French for rotten shot." We were lying down in hole, yes, dug with our very hands. For you gets it quick and sudden if you move about or stands. We was sharing half a fag, yes, turn and turn about, when I felt he moved towards me. And he said, "Odd mate, I'm out." His eyes, they couldn't see me. Nor never will, no more. But his twisted mouth just whispered, "So long, matey. Au revoir." But there was none quite the same to me, 'cause him and me were pals. And if I could have him back again, you could keep your fancy gals. But he's talking French in heaven now, so it's no use feeling sore. But God knows how I miss him. So long, Spotty. Au revoir.
In a remarkable exercise spanning 15 years, the last survivors of the Great War were interviewed on film. These are unique stories of courage, sacrifice, and tragedy, told by the men who were there. These extraordinary interviews have been brought together for the first time. In this film, we hear from the veterans who survived one of the most infamous battles of the entire war, the Battle of the Somme.
I'm like this, in the trench, with a cigarette, my last cigarette in my fingers, and I was like that. I don't mind telling you.
All feelings of humanity leaves you when you're fighting. You've got no feelings of humanity right then. Afterwards, yes, perhaps.
These are the last voices of World War I. On the Western Front, 1916 began as the previous year had ended, in stalemate. Both Allied and German forces lay holed up in fortified trenches which stretched from the Belgian coast to the Swiss Alps, and attempts by either side to break the deadlock had proven ultimately unsuccessful. In Sir Douglas Haig, however, the British Army had a new commander-in-chief, and he quickly began planning the big push that he hoped would prove decisive. After much deliberation, it was agreed that the British would support the French in a massed attack on German positions along a 25-mile front north of the River Somme. These plans were quickly thwarted, however, when German forces attacked the French fortress town of Verdun. As French divisions were hastily transferred to protect the town, the burden of responsibility on the Somme fell to the British. In this rolling, chalky landscape, the Germans had dug deep, well-protected defenses in the high ground. Breaking through these positions would be difficult and dangerous. But for some of those who'd been in the front lines for over a year, the big push couldn't come soon enough. 21-year-old Londoner Richard Hawkins was an officer in the Royal Fusiliers.
People said that Haig was wrong in making us go and fight the enemy. Damn it, we couldn't sit there forever. You got to get on with the job. The French had been very nearly knocked out, and we got to get on with the job and kill the Germans.
The date of the offensive was originally set for the 29th of June, but owing to bad weather, it was postponed to the 1st of July. A week before, the biggest artillery bombardment in history opened up on the Western Front, as over 1.5 million shells rained down on German positions. In preparation for the attack, more men from Kitchener's volunteer army arrived in France to take up positions in the front line. Among them was 21-year-old Tom Dewing from Norfolk.
We were all convinced that this was the push which was to end the war. We were certainly very impressed with the thunder of the guns because it started all at once. And terrific. And it went on and on and on. Thunder, thunder, thunder. With the practice here, you could pick out the individual types of gun firing.
The bombardment was intended to shatter both the German defences and the will of the defenders. According to the plans, once the shelling had stopped, the infantry would be able to advance across no man's land with ease, opening up routes for the cavalry to exploit at will. 19-year-old infantryman Arthur Wagstaff had complete confidence in the British plans.
Our instructions the previous day, of course, were that when you make the attack tomorrow morning, don't run. Walk across. We believed that our bombardment of the German front line would be knocking out quite a lot of German troops. So hopefully when we got there, there wouldn't be many there.
The attack would begin at 7:30 a.m, with wave after wave of men going over the top along a 25-mile front. Despite the overwhelming sense of confidence, as 0 hour approached, even the most eager of officers began to feel some degree of trepidation at the task ahead.
You couldn't help being a bit frightened, I think. But you couldn't show it. Got to bottle it up. You were surrounded with a lot of damn good chaps. They were all damn good fellas out to fight for their country. As Kitchener said, your king and country needs you. And we were out. That was the first. You got shot. Well, that's too bad.
As they waited with anticipation for the attack to begin, few could have any idea that in the hours that followed, they would become embroiled in the bloodiest day in the history of the British Army. On the morning of July the 1st, 1916, over 120,000 British troops waited for the signal that would launch perhaps the most infamous battle in history, the Battle of the Somme. A week-long artillery bombardment had sent shrapnel, high explosive and poison gas shells along a 25-mile stretch of the German lines. The ground assault that was to follow was expected to be a walkover. Such was the confidence of British generals in a swift breakthrough that cameras were allowed to record the events for cinema-goers back home. But as 0 hour approached, there were none of the usual images of happy men grinning for the cameras. These Lancashire Fusiliers had every reason to look afraid. Little did they or the majority of frontline troops know, but the week-long bombardment had failed to destroy the German defences. Instead, the enemy sheltered deep within their fortified dugouts, and with machine guns and rifles at the ready, they waited. They couldn't know it, but within the next half an hour, nearly all these men would be dead or wounded. As the big guns fell silent and troops in the front line readied themselves for the attack, a series of huge mines were detonated close to German positions to destroy enemy strongholds and provide shelter for the advancing troops. Just 2 minutes later, the Battle of the Somme would begin. From his vantage point on high ground, signaller Tom Dewing watched as the catastrophic events of the day began to unfold.
I remember the mine going up. We had been told beforehand that it was going up, and there was a terrific explosion. The whole ground shook, and that came a few seconds after the explosion itself.
At At 7:30 a.m., the whistles blew to begin the attack, and along the length of the front line, men scrambled over trench parapets and made their way towards the German lines. Within minutes, thousands were cut down by German machine gun fire and shrapnel. At the northern end of the line, Arthur Wagstaff went over the top with the 56th London Division near the village of Gomcourt.
As soon as we got the instructions to jump over the top, we went, and our company sergeant major was sitting on the parapet and yelling to the boys, "Go on, boys, over the top, over the top." And as I came up into the trench, I could see 2 or 3 of our fellows, including 2 brothers who were lying dead in the trench. They had been killed, of course, by the German gunfire. Then we looked along the line, and we realised there were very few of us left.
In these woods further south, the Lonsdale Battalion prepared to advance across this open ground to attack a German strongpoint known as Mouquet Farm. 22-year-old Fred Francis was amongst those waiting for the attack to begin.
At 0 hour, when we filed out of this wood, the colonel patted me on the back. He said, "Good luck, son." But we were literally sitting ducks. They just mowed us down like grass in the hayfield.
Shortly after 7:30 a.m., signaller Tom Dewing looked out across this valley as men from the 34th Division made their way across the sloping ground towards the German front line.
In the first place, there was a certain amount of mist. And then when you add to that the enormous amount of smoke from the barrage, a great deal was hidden. When the mist cleared and the smoke cleared, we were able to see the infantry going forward. In some cases, they didn't get very far. They were just wiped out.
Seconds after leaving the safety of these woods, Fred Francis was shot in the hip by machine gun fire as all around him his colleagues were being mown down.
And I dropped on my face and put my steel helmet on the back of my head, and I could hear the shrapnel dropping on my steel helmet. I just said to myself, this is the last of the Lonsdale Battalion. There'll be no battalion left after this, and there wasn't, and never has been. I'm the only survivor, I think, of the original Lonsdale Battalion.
With so many casualties lying wounded in no man's land, the job of stretcher bearers was dangerous and exhausting. But in the heat of the battle, they had little time to reflect on the precariousness of their situation. 20-year-old travelling salesman Joe Yarwood had joined the Royal Army Medical Corps after being handed a white feather, the symbol of cowardice. He was proving his bravery now.
You were just walking like an automaton, you know, you want to keep going backward and forward, and you didn't bother to think a lot about things. It's true, you know, if you're got something on your mind, our job was to get rid of these people as quickly as possible. It was simple as that. Keep going, keep going, keep going. The first one I took out, the poor fellow shot through the head, and we had to lift him down onto a stretcher and then take him off. And it was a very uncomfortable feeling because they got this fellow right through the head and we were expecting any part of our body any minute. We finally got the poor fellow down, and one fellow was walking behind, hanging on to his wrist, because we found that there was a tendency for him to snatch the bandage off. And when we put him down, what did he do? And I, like a silly fool, had felt sorry for the poor fellow, and I put my tunic under him. And I had his brains, and he then, to show a bit of encouragement, vomited all over my tunic. And well, anyway, we carried the poor devil out. I made inquiries about him subsequently, and it was alleged by his comrades of his particular regiment that he was walking about Bradford or wherever he came from with a plate in his head.
But it wasn't all bad news that morning. Significant advances were made in the southern sector, where Richard Hawkins went over the top.
We moved up into the front line trench. Every man was given a packet of woodbines. Stupid thing to say, but I went over smoking a number 11 Abdullah, and that sort of oval cigarette. I don't know why, but it doesn't matter. And there I was 7:30, I think it was a lovely morning, and over the top we went. And actually we had a very good day. The Manchesters were on our right were held up, and somebody else on our left was held up, and that's why we had to stop, really. Otherwise, some idiot said we were going to walk straight through to Berlin.
However, successes like this were sadly few and far between. By the end of the first day, nearly 20,000 British men were killed and over 40,000 wounded. It remains the bloodiest day in the history of the British Army. Arthur Wagstaff spent the entire day in a shell hole, pinned down by machine gun fire, only to emerge after the hours of darkness. Most of his battalion had been lost.
We considered we were lucky. As we went down the communication trench to this tiny village, we reckoned we were lucky to have survived that day, because it was a terrific slaughter.
For those that did survive, hearing the battalion roll call at the end of that day was devastating.
How can you describe seeing a mere handful of men come where you were used to seeing a battalion? And we weren't the only ones who felt sick. The colonels were sitting in front of what was left of their men, sobbing. There were so few men left.
In the days that followed, exhausted troops waited for fresh orders as the full scale of the catastrophe began to sink in. But to press home even the smallest of victories, the battle had to continue, and General Haig and his French counterparts agreed to consolidate their action in the southern sector of the line, where advances had been made. Meanwhile, fresh troops were sent up to the front line to take the place of those who had been killed. It was a fact not lost on 19-year-old officer Norman Collins from Hartlepool, who arrived on the Somme with the Seaforth Highlanders.
You knew by that time the full horrors, the horrors of the war. We were replacing casualties, so for every person who went out to replace a casualty, you knew that somebody had either died or was in hospital. We were fully aware of that.
19-year-old Archie Richards from Cornwall arrived on the Somme in late summer, part of a highly trained group of men at the heart of a top-secret plan aimed to smash the German lines. As his unit moved forward, the sights that awaited him were horrific. In many parts of the front, the dead from the previous days and weeks of fighting still lay where they had fallen.
We were moving up, and we had to go over the old trenches and bodies and everything else, you know, and then the stink. The smell was terrible, terrible, and it was hot. Arms and legs sticking out of trenches and all this sort of stuff, sticking out of rotting bodies. Oh, terrible.
But for men like 20-year-old Robbie Burns from Glasgow, who'd been at the front since 1915, these horrors were now part of everyday life.
Yeah, we know what it's like now. You know what it's like. You know what it's like to sleep. You know what it is like to eat. You know what it is like to go over the top. Oh yes, no doubt about it. You get hardened on. And you wonder all the time when it's going to finish. When is it going to finish? And you're hoping you get a blighty one somewhere. It's not serious.
Some men were so desperate to escape the action, they would do anything to get a blighty wound, an injury not bad enough to be life-threatening, but which would require treatment back home.
The chap is sitting next to me, lying on his stomach. His legs up in the air, like that. He's lying down there. His legs up in the air. I said, keep your legs down. Why? I said, you'll get shot. He said, I want shot. I said, why? He said, well, I want one in the leg, then I'll get one for blighty. I won't need to go on any further. I want wounded. I want wounded in the leg. I don't want to stand up and get shot in the stomach. He was looking for a wound in his leg. I said to this chap here, he said, a good idea that. He did the same. He just lay in his stomach with his legs up in the air like that, hoping to get a bullet in so that he wouldn't have to go on any further.
The bond that developed between men fighting in these conditions ran deep, and some officers felt a paternal affection for the men in their command.
That was your closest feeling at the time. Your affection for the men under you. There's no doubt about that.
And when a man in his company was killed or injured, it was an officer's responsibility to write to his family to inform them. But as every day brought more and more casualties, keeping up this duty was difficult for even the most diligent.
And sometimes he had about 60 letters to write. And he didn't even know who he was writing about. But we always tried to make a nice letter to the mother or father, because we felt for them, we understood what they were feeling.
Thousands more letters would be written before the Battle of the Somme was over. In the meantime, the British were about to unleash a secret weapon they hoped would bring them victory. Archie Richards was one of those selected for the new tank corps. At first, the crews were as mystified as anyone by the giant machines, but quickly began to realize their battle-winning potential.
We saw them, and we talked together about it, and we said, well, what is this? They got tracks, and they must have got an engine, and they must crawl around. You know what I mean? And we sized them up that way. An armored crawler, that's what I called it. And of course, when we got in them and got moving around with them, well, we knew exactly what they were for. And the armaments, when we got inside and we saw the armaments, we said, well, this is really it.
As the Battle of the Somme entered its third month, the crews prepared themselves for their baptism of fire. The age of the tank had arrived. Throughout the July and August of 1916, the Allies made slow progress on the Somme. Gains were made both in the north and south sectors, but at great cost. By the beginning of September, General Haig called for a further all-out attack to break through German lines once and for all. All available divisions would be required for the offensive to try to smash through German positions between the villages of Flers and Courcelette. It would be the greatest British attack since the opening day on the Somme. The offensive would also see the unveiling of Britain's new secret weapon, the tank. These armoured landships had been designed to plough their way across no man's land, to break through barbed wire and destroy German machine gun positions. However, they were untested in battle, and Haig was well aware of the potential limitations of these new mechanical monsters and unsure of the best way to employ them. But as the first tanks rumbled into position, they gave a considerable boost to frontline troops about to go into action.
I was out in a trench out there with some others, and I could hear a purr going on. And I thought, what's that noise? It's getting louder and louder now. I stood on the fire step, and I could see something moving, like what we call in Scotland a steam road roller. And I said, look, and they all started looking. Some got up on the parapet, and the Germans too were up on the parapet, looking at what was happening. And we could see these things moving. And behind them, there were probably 4 or 5 or 6 soldiers running behind with their bayonets fixed.
The Battle of Flers-Courcelette began on the morning of the 15th of September 1916. This ridge, less than 2 miles south of Flers, formed part of the British front line, and it was here that 19-year-old George Louth from Hampshire waited nervously for the attack to begin.
I'm like this, in the trench, with a cigarette, my last cigarette in my fingers, and I was like that. I don't mind telling you. When we got over the top, I lay down after running forward. Now, I could hear the whistle of the bullets going by, and I saw a line of Germans come up on top of the trench. I thought to myself, Christ, they're coming towards us. But they wasn't. They were going away. Then I started walking.
In the confusion of battle, George found himself lost near these fields at Delville Wood, but he was quickly ordered to get back into action.
And an officer came running out from somewhere. I don't know who he was, but he came out waving this revolver, and he said, lads, this way. I'll shoot the first bastard that goes the other way. And then I try to catch up with him when they were going forward. But I somehow got lost and went out through the wood, started walking across the played field. And on the way, I saw a tank. And when he went across, it stopped about halfway across, which was about 3 kilometres away from Flers.
The tank was numbered D7, with Archie Richards at the guns. It had broken down just a short distance from its start point, and it wasn't the only one. The opening day of battle highlighted serious flaws with the Army's new weapon. Of the 49 tanks available for action that morning, only 32 had reached the starting point for battle. Of these, 14 either suffered mechanical failure, got stuck in shell holes, or were knocked out by enemy fire. But for those that kept going, the effects were dramatic. When Archie and his crew were given another vehicle, they made devastating progress. Nothing got in their way.
We had to go over previous dead and dead that you'd killed. If they fell in your way, you had to go over. We never deviated the tanks for anything. Only for action, you know. All feelings of humanity leaves you when you're fighting. You say to yourself, well, it's either him or me. See? So I got to get in first. So you've got no feelings of humanity right then. Afterwards, yes, perhaps.
And inside the tanks, conditions were almost unbearable.
Well, the atmosphere was very, very sickening, really. Especially when you were in action and all the traps closed down. And splinters from the machine guns flying inside when we were in action. Flying all about, little sparks. A terrible, terrible noise with our guns firing, the German guns firing, and machine guns going, and the noise of our engine and everything. Oh, yeah, shocking.
But despite the conditions for the crews, when the tanks managed to get to the German trenches, the effect was nothing short of spectacular. Hundreds surrendered as panic swept through the lines.
They'd never seen anything like it before. But when they saw we was armed with small guns and machine guns, they gave up right away. It's surprising. We hadn't time to get on top of the trench before they was out with their arms up.
A week after the start of the battle, the village of Flers was in British hands. Although the tanks had revealed their weaknesses, they had undoubtedly played a significant part in the advance, and their crews were heralded as heroes. But the big push had fallen short of its objective. British troops had failed to break through German lines, and many formidable German defense positions remained intact. Conditions on the Somme were fast becoming unbearable. Shell fire had churned up the battlefields, and in places, British front-line positions were little more than a series of connected shell holes. Simply getting food rations and water to the men at the front was becoming a logistical nightmare. On the 13th of November, the Allies launched an attack on Beaumont-Hamel, a village which had been part of a failed assault on the 1st of July. On that day, the 1st Newfoundland Regiment had been virtually wiped out in the attack, and their bodies still littered the battlefield. As 0 hour approached, 19-year-old officer Norman Collins gave encouragement to the men in his command.
You're looking at your watch to see 0 hour. And then you look and see that your men, the men you're going to go over the top with, are left and right, are equipped and ready to go. And then you encourage them, right and left, to go with you, all go together. So you sort of shepherded them over as well as you could. And that's the only description I could give you. You were a shepherd. Yes. And all the time, I have no doubt whatever that I was as frightened as anything, and hoping, probably even have a faint hope, that I would survive.
After an heroic effort, Beaumont Hamel was captured later that same day. But there was to be no rest for Norman Collins, who was given a grim task.
I was told to collect the newly killed dead, which I did. I took it was stretcher bearers. Unfortunately, the stretcher bearers, a number of them, they were related to the ones who were dead, and it was a bit upsetting. Some of them were their brothers and cousins, especially the Scottish regiment. We had such a lot of the same name, clan name, you see, MacLean. And they, of course, were very upset. Very, very upset.
But it wasn't only his own men that he was ordered to bury.
Then I was told to go back into the no man's land, or rather what was no man's land, and bury the old dead. That is, the dead of the Newfoundland regiment, who had been killed there on July the 1st. The first one I saw, the first one I came across, with his hair growing out of his, still growing from his face. When I touched it, the rats ran out. There was nothing left under the putty except a bone. I just realized then, for me, what death was. A horrible form of death, too.
Not long after leading the attack on Beaumont Hamel, Norman Collins's position came under heavy shell fire.
I knew that this shell, which was, the scream was getting louder and louder, had my name on it. And I wasn't knocked down, but I knew I was hit, and I put my hand down, and I felt that my hand, I saw my hand was covered in blood, but I turned round and all my men were on the floor, either dead or wounded. And they were crying out, they were very badly wounded, some of them.
Putting the lives of his men before his own, Norman helped the wounded into an ambulance, only getting in himself once the last man was safe. He was on his way home to Blighty.
So I got into the ambulance, having completed my mission, I suppose, and off we went. And as the ambulance drove away, you could hear the gunfire getting farther and farther away as you went along, and finally there were no guns at all.
The Battle of the Somme finally ended on the 19th of November 1916. In the 4 months of fighting, the Allies had captured little more than 6 miles of ground at a cost of over 600,000 men killed or wounded. The debate over whether Haig's tactics to wage a war of attrition were right continues to this day, but many of the men who followed his orders in the summer of 1916 felt happy to have done so. One of those was 20-year-old Robbie Burns, whose war came to an end when he was hit by shrapnel. Despite nearly losing his leg, he remained optimistic about his contribution to the war effort.
I was happy. I knew I did something for my country. I felt happy and I still feel happy. But yes, I still feel very happy that I was in that war and that came out. Because as we say, if it hadn't been for us, a lot of people wouldn't be here today. And I still maintain that. Some of those fellows gave their lives so that other people could live. And I'm still content that they saved us all, they saved the country.
Another whose physical injuries would stay with him for the rest of his life was 19-year-old George Louth. Having spent nearly 2 years at the front, the deafening noise of artillery fire had seriously damaged his hearing, and he became a danger to himself and his colleagues.
Now, going back one night, I went back with the sergeant, and he said, "Stop, stop," he said. We stopped by a hedge, and he said, "We'll wait here a minute." I said, "What'd you stop for?" He said, "Can't you hear that going across?" I said, "What?" "All them shells. You can't hear it." I said, "No, I can't hear it." "Oh," he said, "you're no good to me." And I started crying because it went off deaf. I couldn't hardly hear what they were talking about. So I decided that I told the sergeant, "I'm going to go sick in the morning, find out what it is."
George's deafness was confirmed by the doctors, and he was sent home to England, where he spent the rest of the war working on the land. But for some of those who fought on the Somme, the injuries were mental rather than physical, as living with the constant threat of death shattered minds as well as bodies. During the course of the Great War, a new medical condition was discovered by doctors treating soldiers exposed to frontline action: shell shock. By the end of the war, some 80,000 British soldiers were diagnosed with this debilitating condition, which caused shakes, tremors, and periods of extreme anxiety. Having spent 2 terrifying months in a tank during the Battle of the Somme, 19-year-old Archie Richards from Cornwall began to feel the mental effects of frontline duty.
I was shell-shocked at that time. Oh yes, there was no doubt about that. I was shell-shocked. I wasn't in my right senses or anything else, you know. Makes you feel cringy, and it makes you feel, I don't know, it makes you feel bad in yourself. Real bad. You begin to do like this, and I never did that before. But every time a big shell crashed, okay, the tremendous corrupt noise they make, oh, like a crashing, like, well, I don't know what. A terrible crash, because they were dropping near, see? And every time one dropped, I clenched up like this. Well, I never did that before. So that shows I was shocked. And I couldn't believe myself at the time. I couldn't believe it. That I thought my nerves would carry me, but no, it broke my nerve.
These symptoms could manifest themselves years later, even in the most able of soldiers. 21-year-old officer Richard Hawkins was sent home to England after being wounded on the Somme. After the war, he had a successful career in sales and advertising, but often struggled with a nervous condition caused by his experiences in the front line.
After the war, I was troubled for a good many years by a difficulty in speaking. It was hardly a stammer. It wasn't stuttering, but it was awfully difficult in business occasionally to go to a meeting and have to say something. It was a tremendous strain on one's nervous system, which had pretty well been shattered after 19 months in the front line, pretty well. But one couldn't sleep at night and that sort of thing.
Despite all this, Richard always looked back on his wartime experiences with great pride and a deep affection for the men in his command.
nice, decent blokes. We all had great fun, really. Tremendous fun. Enjoyed ourselves. I personally enjoyed the Ruddy War, I think. I don't know why, but it was great fun.
For all the horrors experienced by those who fought in the Battle of the Somme, the lasting memory for many is of lost colleagues. After the war, Norman Collins experienced a vivid apparition, a haunting tribute to the friends who had given their lives for king and country.
I had a vision, and I was standing in a trench, and at eye level, there were legs going, feet, marching feet going along. No heads, just feet, legs marching along. And there were all the men I visualized who were killed in the war. And there they were going on, marching away, marching into a distance where I would never follow, you see. All the people I knew have gone, except me.
In a remarkable exercise spanning 15 years, the last survivors of the Great War were interviewed on film. These are unique stories of courage, sacrifice, and tragedy, told by the men and women who were there. These extraordinary interviews have been brought together for the first time. In this film, we hear from soldiers who suffered terrible injuries in the fighting, and from those who helped to save their lives. From the stretcher bearers who dashed into no man's land to rescue them, to the young nurses whose devotion to duty helped them to recover.
Heap of rags, most of them. And that was awful to handle them. You know, you practically pick them up in pieces.
This young fella, he did want his mummy so much, he cried for his mummy. Oh, I said, I'll be your mummy tonight, and I gave him a hug.
I can tell you truly, there was a state where I just wanted to give in, you know? It would have been, you know, quite pleasant. Give up the struggle.
These are the last voices of World War I. Ever since the days of Florence Nightingale and her campaign for soldiers' welfare during the Crimean War, the British Army has prided itself on the quality of its medical care. But during the course of the First World War, the number of casualties far exceeded anything that had gone before. In the 4 years of fighting, over 2 million British and Commonwealth soldiers were wounded. In the days of industrialized warfare, Machine gun bullets and shell fire caused dreadful wounds, and in the worst battles there could be well over 10,000 casualties in a single day. The strain on Britain's medical services was enormous. Soldiers at the front lived with the constant threat of death or injury, and the life-changing moment when the shrapnel from a shell or the bullet from a sniper's rifle tore into their flesh could happen without warning. 19-year-old Jock Gaffron arrived on the Somme in May 1916.
All my life I've had hunches that something is going to happen, and they've come true. And I said to my friend next to me, I said, what a nice morning for a cushy blighty and home. Cushy being was a real nice one, see? And I never remember another thing. I've no earthly idea what came down or how it came down, but I just had one stiffening bang, and I went like a poker. And when I came to, I noticed that my right foot had gone. I was hit behind the heel, which took the sole clean away. And the big toe was left dangling round and round and round, you see. So the Red Cross men, when they came, they just casually cut the toe away and threw it on the roadside.
For Jock, this brutal roadside amputation was just the first of a series of painful operations, hardly the cushy blighty he had hoped for. For men wounded at the front, initial help came from stretcher bearers, both from their own battalion and from those in the Royal Army Medical Corps. Often trained only in the basics of first aid, these men risked life and limb to recover the injured from the battlefields. 19-year-old Dick Barron from Liverpool was one of them. Like so many who served in the Great War, he had volunteered out of a sense of duty and patriotism instilled in him during his school days.
I think I got my idea with a lot of young fellas from Boys' Own Paper, and the soldiers were very, very spectacular creatures. And how they fought in the Crimea and the wonderful charge of the Light Brigade. It was all very romantic. We didn't think of the worst part of warfare. We had no idea, it was only very spectacular.
As a member of the Boys' Life Brigade, Dick had won trophies for his first aid skills, a fact quickly picked up by his recruiting sergeant.
A number of chaps from the Boys' Life Brigade, we went up to Duke York's headquarters, Slimska, and we all joined up together. And when they learnt my history, I was sent immediately to the field ambulance.
It wasn't just men who volunteered to serve their country. With the expansion of wartime nursing services, thousands of young women were drawn into a profession they had never previously considered. Nora Clay from Macclesfield had been inspired to volunteer after both her father and brother were sent overseas to fight. When her brother was killed, she threw herself wholeheartedly into her new career.
Well, my brother was killed by the Turks, and that was a fearful blow to me. And I think it did rather alter my feeling to these men, that you felt that you wanted to do anything you could to get them well and to make them happy. I went to Leeds, a very unsophisticated little 20-year-old, but I loved it. And it was there, you see, that I had my first introduction to wounded soldiers.
The number of men wounded overseas grew more rapidly than anyone had expected. A week after the Battle of Mons in August 1914, of the 90,000 men of the British Expeditionary Force sent to France, 1 in 6 was reported as a casualty. Although this figure included those taken prisoner, the large majority would have been wounded men. When Dick Barron set sail for the front in September 1914, the reaction of the other soldiers on board ship quickly brought home the fact that his chances of making it back in one piece were slim.
The whole of the ship's company, from the top deck right down, including ourselves, suddenly burst into song in unison. Homeland, homeland, when shall I see you again? Land of my birth, dearest place on earth, I'm leaving you. Oh, it may be for years, and it may be forever. Homeland, homeland. Up to then, the whole thing had been most enjoyable, but my heart stood still. I suddenly realized that this was a warfare. I may not return. My heart stood still, and we set sail.
Within weeks, thoughts of homeland had all but vanished, and Dick was lying in a hospital ward wishing he was dead. The romanticism that had led him to volunteer would soon be gone forever. The Royal Army Medical Corps was formed in 1898, and by the outbreak of the Great War, the RAMC had 9,000 officers and men in its ranks. But such were the terrible casualty rates that by the end of the fighting, that figure had risen to over 110,000. For men wounded at the front, their chances of survival depended on how quickly their injuries were treated, and a chain of evacuation was put in place to ensure medical care was administered as soon as possible. Stretcher bearers like 19-year-old Dick Barron had the arduous task of carrying the wounded from no man's land back to regimental aid posts and advanced dressing stations.
It's bloody awful. If you ever carried a chap on a stretcher, I felt that my arms were coming out their sockets. A chap gets very heavy, you know, to carry him very far on a stretcher. I was only a youth, and I hadn't got all that strength. To carry a chap on the stretcher, you don't want to have to go very far with him. Especially when you've got across terrain where it's all bumpy and very difficult terrain. So work on a stretcher is very exhausting.
The men worked in teams with a minimum of 2 to a casualty, increasing to 4 or more where the terrain was difficult. It was dangerous work, and many stretcher bearers became casualties themselves as they searched for the wounded in no man's land. When he was posted to the front, 19-year-old Bill Easton from Norfolk was teamed up with a more experienced stretcher bearer called Tom Barris, who did his best to put Bill at ease.
He told me, he said, if you're going to be hit for one of these shells, you'll get hit, and that's all you'll know. He'd say, so I kick up a hell of a fuss about it. He used to swear like a trooper, and Tommy was an inspiration. The time I was with him, we walked through, I don't know how many shells used to come over, but they were flying overhead, and Tommy would be walking along with it and take no notes of them. Stick your head up, he said, and get along.
But nothing could prepare stretcher bearers like Bill for the terrible consequences of modern warfare. Most wounds came from shell fire, and shrapnel had a devastating effect on the human body.
Most of them, they were chest or stomach wounds, and they were really serious. And that was awful to handle them. You know, you'd practically pick them up in pieces, but if they were still alive, you had to cart them away, and you know jolly well that they'd die at any time. The main thing was getting them out of it, and that's what we used to do.
Although the priority for stretcher bearers was the speedy evacuation of the wounded, they did carry basic field dressings for use in emergencies, but these were of little use in cases of severe blood loss.
If blood was coming with pulses, you know, you felt and you knew that he'd had it. And all you could do was to put a dressing on and either send him back or... But you felt you had to do something. You know what I mean? Even if it was only putting a dressing on it.
It was unavoidable, but Bill Easton hated having the blood of wounded men on his hands.
I didn't like it. If you had to touch a man and you got it and that dried on your hands, that was a horrible feeling. They used to be sticky and awful. I used to hate it. Horrible feeling.
Fortunately, in most cases, the stretcher bearers didn't know the identity of the men they were rescuing. But only weeks after going into action, Dick Barron saw one of his close friends hit in the head by shrapnel.
He fell, and I looked at it, and I could see his brains, and sounds gruesome, but all I could do was to put the brain, which had exuded through the wound, back into the cranium. You can't imagine to see your pal with like that. You felt you've got to do something. And that's what I did. It was no good, of course, was it?
In an instant, Dick had learnt the dreadful truth behind the boy's own stories that had led him to join up.
I had been long in warfare, where it lost all its romanticism. Warfare was a grim, unsatisfactory, bloody silly business.
Wounded soldiers recovered from the battlefields were given first aid before being taken by ambulance to casualty clearing stations, normally located around 20 miles behind the front lines. Here, the men received emergency operations, including amputations, before being sent on to base hospitals near the coast. After battle, these clearing stations were often so overrun with casualties that surgeons operated round the clock without a break, and unqualified staff dressed wounds and even anaesthetized patients. As a volunteer nurse, Marjorie Grigsby from Portsmouth spent part of her war working in a clearing station in France.
Hell. Absolute hell. We were doing things we knew nothing about, giving injections to people with legs hanging out of trousers, heads half blown off, and using the same needle just dipped in carbolic 20, just one after another. We didn't really know what we were doing. All we were anxious to do was to put them out of their pain. It's an absolute medley, really, of blood and thunder.
Initially, only fully trained nurses were allowed to serve at the front. But by the autumn of 1915, the medical services were so overrun that unpaid volunteer nurses like Marjorie were sent abroad to help. These nurses, or VADs as they became known, after the voluntary aid detachments they had joined, were often from sheltered middle and upper class families. With only basic first aid training, it was a shock to find themselves suddenly nursing and comforting men close to death. Often, there was little they could do to help them.
I remember once I said to one, "Have you got a mother and father?" And he said, "I haven't got a mother, she's dead." But I said to him, "Well, you'll be with her in a few minutes, so don't worry." And that was all I said to him. There wasn't anything else to say.
Those who made it through the casualty clearing stations were taken to base hospitals set up near the coast in towns like Rouen and Calais. The injured remained here until they were either sent home to England or deemed fit enough to return to their units. Although they were far enough behind the lines to avoid shell fire, base hospitals were sometimes hit during air raids. Whether intentional or not, the results made effective propaganda. This newsreel shows the funeral of nurses and patients killed when the base hospital at Étaples was bombed in 1918. 23-year-old nurse Alice Blood from Bourne in Lincolnshire was working at Étaples when the bombs fell. Her ward was close to the stable block.
And I had 10 patients on one side and 10 on that side. And I'd walk up and down, up and down. Well, this night, they dropped a bomb, which I suppose was meant for us. We had big red crosses on the roof, all our roofs. But they dropped the bomb, and it missed us, evidently, and it hit the horses. The noise was something terrible, something terrible. I never knew before that a horse could scream all over, screaming. And that was that week. I kept walking up and down as fast as I could, because the men, of course, I think they were more nervous than I was. But I always thought if I walked up and down, perhaps the bomb would drop the other end, and I'd be that end. Then I'd walk back again, back and forth I'd go.
It was to the hospital at Camiers, just north of Étaples, that 19-year-old Jock Gaffron was taken after being hit by a shell. He'd already had his toe cut off in a hasty roadside amputation, and the sole of his foot had been completely blown away by the blast.
And the doctors had a look at me, and I said that I did not want to lose my leg, my foot, if possible. But he said, "We will do what we can," but it was hopeless. The foot had to go, and that was that. They put me on a table with a mattress. I think it was in the kitchen that they did it. And at last, they say I had the chloroform in those days. And it was done. They amputated my foot through the ankle. And I can assure you that was no easy job. And it was extremely painful. I can assure you, if I ever howled in my life when I came out, I howled then. I made no bones about it. I really cried my eyes out when I saw the result. At my age, to have that injury was quite a shock. It meant that you would have to adapt your life in many ways. And that's just what I had to do.
The final stage in the evacuation of wounded soldiers was the journey back to Blighty. Ambulance trains and barges were used to transport the men to hospital ships waiting at the ports. It was the moment most soldiers longed for. 20-year-old Londoner Fred Taylor was hit by shrapnel from an exploding shell just 4 weeks before the end of the war. After being rushed to an operating theatre, Fred was taken to an ambulance train. Only then did he discover the true extent of his injuries.
It was one of those ambulance trains where there's no seats. There are racks, and there's 3 racks on each side of the carriage, and the centre's all empty. So when they lifted me up to the officials that were inside the train, they called out, "What's this one?" And the chap looked at the label on me and said, "It's amputation." And that's the first I knew that it was off. So I put my head down and there it was, gone. So they just put me on the bottom deck. I wasn't in any pain. I hadn't been in any pain all along when I was wounded or anything. I just didn't feel any pain. So it was quite a shock to hear someone say, "You've got an amputation." That was the finish until I got out of Carlisle.
For many of the men who crossed the Channel back to England, there followed a long and painful period of rehabilitation. Some would have to undergo further operations and learn how to use artificial limbs, while others suffered from dreadful mental illness. And all the while, the nurses who cared for them put on a brave face as they dressed gangrenous wounds, helped to sever limbs and cradled dying men in their arms. For them, the horrors of war were just beginning. During the Great War, perhaps the biggest threat facing men wounded at the front was the onset of gangrene. In the days before antibiotics, gangrene spread quickly, and without the swift amputation of the affected area, soldiers had little chance of recovery. Most feared was the condition known as gas gangrene, caused by bacteria which thrived in the muddy fields of France, often entering wounds on fragments of filthy uniforms pushed into the body by shrapnel. General Nurse Nora Clay worked at a hospital in Leeds.
They came in with terribly septic, deep, gangrenous wounds. And one of my vivid recollections when I was on the military ward was a man with a gaping wound about 14 inches long, right down to the bones of his lower leg, and I should think about 2 inches deep, and in the depth of that wound there was patches of gangrene. And they found that by introducing maggots into the wound, the maggots ate the gangrene, and then they could start to heal the leg up. That was a shock to me, to see, first of all, these nasty little things crawling about in the man's leg. They didn't come loose in the bed. It was exposed, you see, and they were having their feed.
Over 40,000 British soldiers lost limbs due to their injuries, and many of these amputations were carried out once the man had returned home. For the untrained volunteer nurses, witnessing their first amputation was a shocking rite of passage.
I was warned by somebody who knew that if, when you go first time into the theatre, so many nurses who attend their first operation will faint when the first incision's made. But if you make a point of looking over there when they're doing the incision there, and then turn your head afterwards, if you don't see the first incision made, you're all right. You stick it out. But if you see the blood oozing out, you're done for. And I found that worked beautifully. I've never fainted in the theatre years. And I've done a lot of theatre work.
Nora Clay saw so many amputations they became a routine part of her work.
If I was on the theatre staff, then I would help to cover him with sterile towels, just exposing the leg that was going to be amputated. And I can't remember that I was ever what you call deeply affected by the sight of the tissues being divided and the bone either being cut through or disjointed and the limb carried away. It may sound heartless, but it's all part of the training.
When Jock Gaffron returned to England after having his foot amputated, he was sent to hospital in York. He was on the ward when doctors noticed that gangrene had formed in his wound.
When I heard them mention gangrene, I was terrified. They took my leg off from the ankle to 6 inches below the knee. And that was a big one. And I can assure it was sore, very sore. And I felt it. And once again, I did a hell of a lot of crying. Good, hefty stuff.
Jock's ordeal didn't end there. He began to suffer from terrible phantom pains and also had to endure the agony of having his dressings regularly changed.
Dressing time was an ordeal at all times. I dreaded this because the bandages that I had on had dried and they had to be pulled away. And much of the dressing adhered to the skin.
Jock's stay in hospital was made bearable only through the friendship he made with a volunteer nurse, known simply to him as Nurse Sutherland.
She was my nurse, and she certainly looked after me in every way. It wasn't a case of attraction or anything. It was a case she was good at her job. Very good at her job. She never spoke hardly except words of comfort, and I did nothing else but cry. And being a soldier and being 20 or 21, I didn't want to be more or less a child and cried down. But cry I did, and plenty of it.
For all amputees coming to terms with their disability, there followed the awful realization that life would never be the same again. One-time apprentice printer Fred Taylor was 20 when he lost his leg, just 4 weeks before the end of the war.
You just wonder, what the future holds. You don't think of it. I don't think you think of one thing in particular, because your whole life is going to be different, isn't it? You see? So that's what I think. That's the way I look at it anyway. I think that's the way it affects you. Some people may not be able to stand the strain. In my case, you can't do the same job. And so what's your parents going to say or do? what else can you do? You don't know, you can't think straight. So you just hope for the best.
The other great threat to men at the front was disease. Rotting bodies could lie on the battlefields for weeks, and rats and lice were a constant nuisance. In these conditions, trench hygiene was an important part of the daily routine, but there were still outbreaks of illnesses like typhus and dysentery. The 1918 influenza pandemic that killed over 20 million people worldwide ravaged the armies of both sides, as the close proximity of the men, combined with frequent troop movements, helped the virus to spread. Stretcher bearer Dick Barron was struck down by dysentery, but being a conscientious volunteer, he tried to carry on as normal. It nearly cost him his life.
You know, I delayed too long. Silly little boy, silly kid, really. I should have reported sick earlier. Would have stood much more chance. And one morning I found I couldn't stand, and I had to be a casualty. I was dangerously ill. I thought and I hoped I was going to die, and the medical officer, I'm sure, never thought I would recover. And I can tell you truly, there was a state where I just wanted to give in. You know, it would have been, you know, quite pleasant. Give up the struggle. That's how I can't describe it more than that. That death had no fear for me.
Not all injuries suffered by men at the front were physical. By the end of the war, 30,000 men had been returned to Britain suffering from shell shock. This remarkable film, made in 1917, captured in stark clarity the debilitating effects of this frightening mental illness. In 1918, Mary Jolly from Edinburgh was made a sister on a specialist shell shock ward in Notts County War Hospital, where she saw the effects of the condition at first hand.
The appearance of the men was very terrible to see, because they were trembling, facial trembling, and hands trembling, and they just couldn't control themselves, although they tried hard to control, because they probably knew that they were upsetting the person who was treating them. But it was very terrible to see. And they had tremors, hands and face. Saliva even, could be dripping with saliva.
But for Mary, the most upsetting aspect of shell shock were the nightmares suffered by the men in the darkness of her hospital ward, terrifying flashbacks to the scenes of horror that they had witnessed but were unable to talk about.
There was one soldier, and he was so afraid of going to sleep because of the nightmares that he had. And of course, it wasn't my business to go into that. That was the medical officer's business. But I couldn't help trying to ease the situation. And I said, "What did you see?" And he said, "Well, I saw wounded men on the ground. And our tanks coming along and just mowing through the wounded men." He said it was very terrible. But that was one of the worst ones. Hurt me very much. Hurts me now.
Despite the dreadful condition of the men, nurses like Mary had to put on a brave face and do their best not to reveal their true feelings. It was essential to keep up the good spirits of their patients.
naturally the nurses knew from what they'd heard, what they'd endured. And so one felt sympathetic towards them. And I think a nurse develops a certain amount of what I call motherliness, the fact that she may only be in her early 20s, but because you've been caring for people so closely, you develop that feeling that you are responsible for their happiness.
Nurse Alice Blood never forgot the night when she had to play a parental role to a young soldier who was about to be returned home to England suffering from severe flu.
This young fella, I suppose he was perhaps taller than I was, but he did want his mummy so much. He cried for his mummy. Oh, I said, I'll be your mummy tonight. And I gave him a hug. And he went to sleep quite quietly.
But this act of kindness was the last Alice would do for the young soldier. Although she argued that he was too weak to travel, that night he was taken to a hospital ship for the journey home.
And via the grapevine, I heard that he saw his mummy and then he died. And I still feel sad about that some way. It was kind of unnecessary.
The care the men received from their nurses often meant the difference between life and death. And for some soldiers, the relationships they formed really would change their lives forever. The Great War led to considerable advances in modern medicine. There were significant developments in many fields, including blood transfusions, X-rays, facial surgery, psychiatry, and the manufacture and fitting of artificial limbs. Jock Gaffron was one of those given a new prosthetic leg. He suffered from terrible blisters on his stump as he learned to walk again. But as a disabled war hero, the reaction he got from the public helped to give him the strength he needed to make it through.
If we went out with some of the boys, about a dozen of the boys, wounded boys, we all went in a bus and we went into the movies. We got in for nothing. You were always a bit of a what do you call an eye catcher. They would always stop in the street and look at you, or some people would come up and talk to you. And then sometimes you get packets of cigarettes or chocolates or things like that.
But Jock's greatest source of strength came from his nurse, Nurse Sutherland. After the war, they kept in touch until she moved away. It was some years later when Jock received a surprise letter in the post.
She wrote, and I think she was retiring. I don't know what happened. So I wrote her, and I said I'd come. If I'm coming down with my friend, we'd call her and see her. But about a week before we were due to leave, I had a letter saying that she had died. I don't know the cause or anything, but she eventually died. I missed her a lot.
Although soldiers and their nurses enjoyed recreational time together, romance was strictly forbidden, but that didn't stop it happening. After having his leg amputated in France, gunner Fred Taylor was sent to hospital in Carlisle. Miles from his home in London, Fred became deeply worried about his prospects for the future, but things were about to change.
One day the matron came in with a nurse and said, this is a new nurse for this ward. She said, she comes from London. She said, it might be a bit of a help with you. And as I came from London, I thought that would be very nice. So she came and had a chat after she'd been round all the patients. She come back to me and we had our little chat, I said, and our friendship gradually grew and grew and grew. We used to go to the cinema in Carlisle, but we had to go out of the hospital separately. I said, naturally, I was always on crutches, and she would go out singly and not meet until we were at the cinema. Or even if we went out and had a meal out, it'd be the same.
Despite the furtive beginnings to their relationship, Fred and his nurse, Beattie, were married just after he left hospital. They remained happily together for 62 years. Dick Barron spent weeks in hospital suffering from severe dysentery. He thought and hoped he would die, but the medical care he received eventually began to take effect.
The doctor said to me one morning, Baron, when you're a bit stronger, we're going to send you back to England. Well, that sparked something. All I wanted to do was to get back, to see my really mum and dad and all this. It meant England meant something.
As Dick sailed back to England, there was none of the patriotic singing that had accompanied his journey to war. It took years for him to recover from his illness, but he never forgot the men he lost on the field of battle. And as a stretcher bearer, he saw more than most the courage and sacrifice of the men who gave their lives for their country.
The men that won the war was the ordinary Tommy, who was always cheerful and always got a story to tell. The chap who carries on right through, and when you're tired, he'll carry your pack for you. He's the bloke that won the war.
In a remarkable exercise spanning 15 years, the last survivors of the Great War were interviewed on film. These are unique stories of courage, sacrifice, and tragedy, told by the men who were there. These extraordinary interviews have been brought together for the first time. In this film, we hear from the veterans who fought on the Western Front during 1917. It was a year in which British servicemen suffered in two of the most dreadful battles of the war. The first, fought at Arras, ended in a bloody war of attrition where casualty rates on the ground and in the air were appalling. The second, fought in the muddy swamps near the town of Ypres, has become synonymous with sacrifice and slaughter on an unimaginable scale. Today, it is known simply as Passchendaele.
My job was to kill Germans. I mean, to me, they weren't human beings, you know. I wasn't shooting a man, I was just shooting an object.
It gets dark tonight. Okay, everything may be quiet. Are you going to see the sun come up in the morning? And when the sun comes in the morning, wonder if I should see it set at night. That was the feeling you had. You were living on borrowed time.
These are the last voices of World War I. In the spring of 1917, the British began their next major offensive to the east of the town of Arras. Further south, the French planned a huge assault close to the River Aisne. The Allies hoped the combined attack would bring the German army to its knees. Newsreel cameras captured footage of French villagers welcoming the arrival of this advanced cyclist patrol. But the sights that greeted 19-year-old artillery driver Alfred Henn as he neared Arras were far too horrific ever to be filmed.
We were going through a very narrow street in Arras, and there was element noise going on, guns firing, and anyway, suddenly we came to a halt. And then you could see on the wall opposite, it was full of pieces of flesh blown from horses or men. So it was a very nice position, and we had to sit there until we could move. It was a terrible sight, I tell you, and the poor horses were more frightened than we were, I think.
Zero day for the main offensive was set for the 9th of April, but there were still minor skirmishes in the days leading up to the attack as the Allies sought to regain lost ground. On April the 1st, a party of men from the Honourable Artillery Company were ordered to attack a German trench near the village of Écouste. Tommy Thompson was in the front line and witnessed the reaction of the officer about to lead the attack.
He was terrified and visibly showed it. And that tradition, he should never have been put in there to lead the attack. He was supposed to lead the attack. He shouldn't have done. And I got his servant, and I said, what's the matter with him? He said, he knows he's going to be killed, and he was killed. He's the only one in the party who had to attack this German trench. We got near enough to have both his legs blown off by hand grenade. I can still see him lying back in agony, with his hands clasped. He's one of the 28 were killed. And stupid attacks would never have taken place.
After the horror of the Battle of the Somme, it was hardly surprising that men lived with the constant fear of injury or death. For many, it wasn't only friends and colleagues who had been lost in battle, but courage and patriotic spirit too. To make matters worse, the winter of 1916 had been one of the coldest on record. Those who had survived the Somme had been forced to endure a miserable existence as temperatures plummeted. Alfred Henn had spent the winter freezing on the front line.
Yes, we were always wet through. You had to put up with it. If you was wet all night, you slept in it, and that was it. I'd got a horse,
And he's only got one eye. I called him Nelson. I sat on the horse one day. I was absolutely perished cold, you know, waiting there. And a shell come very, very near and burst about 6 feet from the ground. Huge ball of fire. And I thought, oh, if it had only come a bit closer, I could have warmed my hands on it. I can remember that as plain as anything. I thought if it had come any closer, it would have blown me to pieces.
Living for weeks on end in these dreadful conditions, many thousands began to suffer from a debilitating condition known as trench foot. 19-year-old Andrew Bowie from Edinburgh had arrived on the Somme in the winter of 1916.
The slump came on the instep off my left foot mainly. The right foot wasn't so bad. Came up about the size of a golf ball. Just dirt collecting, pus.
Andrew's foot became so swollen and blistered that he was taken to hospital, and as he discovered, the treatment could be swift and brutal.
So the next day they came round and they had a look at it. The whole thing had burst open. And they said, oh, well, Jock, he says, that saved us a big job. So they passed on, and I beckoned to the corporal. I said, what do they mean by a big job? He looked at his list. Oh, your left leg was due for amputation below the knee.
Andrew's leg was saved, and he was sent to England to recover. But his war was not over yet. By the middle of March 1917, the German army had abandoned the Somme and made a 40-mile withdrawal to a new system of highly fortified defences, known as the Hindenburg Line. In their wake, they left a trail of destruction. Villages were razed to the ground and roads and bridges destroyed to hamper any Allied advance. To break through the German lines, the Allies would be forced to attack the new defences head-on. The Battle of Arras was about to begin. In the spring of 1917, the British planned a major offensive against the Germans east of the town of Arras. Joining the volunteers already at the front was a new breed of soldier, the conscript. Conscription had been introduced early in 1916, and by the end of the year, call-up papers had been delivered to all men between the ages of 18 and 41. Now, these often reluctant soldiers began to arrive in France. Among them was 19-year-old apprentice plumber Harry Patch from Somerset.
I didn't want to go, but it was a case of had to. I live a sheltered life, I suppose, and army life didn't appeal to me at all. I had no inclination to fight anybody. I mean, why should I go out and kill somebody I never knew? For what reason? There was no reason at all in it, in my way of thinking.
There were others who went to extreme lengths to avoid being called up to the trenches. Attracted by the glamour of flying, 19-year-old Bill Hall joined the fledgling Royal Naval Air Service.
Well, first of all, of course, like we all did in those days, we saw the pictures of the soldiers in the trenches. Well, that wasn't for me. All the mud, up to their knees in mud, through the trenches, sleeping in all that mud. Yeah, and then when they had to go over the trenches and through the barbed wire and all that sort of thing, I didn't fancy that. But I thought a pilot, oh, that's lovely. I thought it was something really marvellous because it's very new in those days, piloting and flying. So I thought I'd try it.
Sidney James was also keen to avoid frontline action. So he volunteered for the Royal Flying Corps.
I was in the army to start, and then they asked for volunteers. And then I jumped at the opportunity.
However, like so many who volunteered for service, Sidney found his mother didn't approve of his decision.
She said, "Don't, whatever you do, don't go flying." I said, "But, Mother, don't you realise that all war is dangerous, and I fancy flying, because if it did come down, it would be instant death." It was all a great game to me.
But within months the games would be over, and Britain's new volunteer pilots would find themselves at the heart of the Battle of Arras. On the 4th of April 1917, the British began a 5-day artillery bombardment along a 12-mile stretch of the German lines near Arras. To avoid a repeat of the first day of the Somme, shells were now fitted with a new type of fuse, which detonated on impact to destroy barbed wire fences, and planes from the Royal Flying Corps flew over the trenches to direct artillery fire towards German gun positions. But aerial observation was dangerous work. Flying low over German trenches, many planes were lost to enemy shell fire when they ventured too close.
All you did feel was when enemy bombs, shells came over and just flew under you. That was all you really ever felt. From guns on ground, when it passed under you, you get that up and down. It would create an air wave.
But the Flying Corps was soon to face a far more dangerous adversary, Baron Manfred von Richthofen and his flying circus. The Red Baron was already Germany's most celebrated fighter pilot, with 30 kills to his name. Together with his crack squadron of pilots, he was transferred to the Arras region to help swing the balance of air power back to the Germans. The Battle of the Skies was about to begin. Meanwhile, on the ground at Arras, artillery gunners like 19-year-old Londoner Fred Taylor were relying on the skill and good fortune of the RFC for their coordinates.
Suddenly, the whistle blew, and the boss shouts out, or the sergeant shouts out, "Number 5 gun, prepare for action." He calls out so-and-so, 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 numbers, right or left, and you turn the wheels and that sort of thing until your gun's pointing in the right height and right width. And then suddenly he says, 2 rounds gunfire. Bang goes one, and you open the shell, put the bullet in, shut it, make sure it's on the right, woof, another one. And then he suddenly comes out, shouts out, "Number 5 gun, excellent," he said, right in the middle of them. "Oh, thank you, sir. So, you've done your bit."
While the combined operations of the Royal Flying Corps and artillery units targeted German positions at the front, the Royal Naval Air Service were flying sorties deeper into German territory to destroy munitions and aircraft before they could be deployed. As a bomb aimer, it was Bill Hall's responsibility to make sure they hit their target.
Well, say you had a particular point where we knew they were building certain machines. You see, you'd have a direction to go there, whatever that place was, or perhaps an aerodrome from which the airplanes were giving a lot of trouble. Well, we'd have to go and bomb them. And so everything which affected the German ability to try to overcome the British, whether it was the aeroplane or what it was.
But in 1917, flying long-range missions was a dangerous pursuit, as the primitive aircraft were not always up to the demands of the job. 20-year-old Henry Allingham from London was an air mechanic in the Royal Naval Air Service.
It was very primitive in those days. It wasn't until late 70s that they got really efficient aircraft. Until then, there was a lot of teething troubles and that, and things going wrong. And I've seen fellas fighting for their lives to regain control because little things go wrong. And then they used to cut down, and when you got down, you had to get out playing quick because it caught fire. Well, some of those men had come back from being over the line, and they were just about all in when they got back, you see. And then they didn't get out fast enough. Woof! It was in flames. And you see them burnt alive there, and their arms would go up like that. And you didn't have anything to put that out, nothing whatsoever. So you just had to stand and watch. That was all there was to it.
The Battle of Arras began on the 9th of April 1917, and in the first 2 days of the offensive, the Allies made spectacular progress for relatively few casualties. Troops went over the top behind a creeping barrage of slowly advancing shell fire, which protected them as they made their way towards the German lines. This time, the enemy were unable to offer any significant resistance. Here at last came the opportunity for Tommy Thompson to avenge the loss of his dead colleagues.
And that's when I say I fired the first time and only time I ever fired in anger. I'd fired, I think it must be 110 or 115 shots. And every single one was aimed at a German. And I picked them off one by one. I wish I knew how many I'd killed. I shouldn't be at all surprised it didn't go into 3 figures. Because I was a very good shot. I had very good eyesight. Very good indeed. I mean, to me, they weren't human beings, you know. I wasn't shooting a man, I was just shooting an object.
While the men on the ground continued to advance, in the skies above Arras, Britain's airmen were engaged in a deadly struggle with their German opponents. With a life expectancy of just 18 hours in the air, it was a terrifying time to be a pilot. Dealing with the daily loss of friends and colleagues was painful, but in the heat of the battle, there was no time for grief.
You lost a man, you wouldn't mention his name again, which was sensible. And so that was the only way. If you did, you know, it'd all boil up. So you had to obliterate it.
Sidney James, however, was one of those having some success shooting down enemy planes.
I forget how many. I know I shot one or two down. I think they very often managed to glide down into their own country. So whether they were killed, you never found out. And you got a feeling of satisfaction when they went down.
245 British planes were lost in a month of aerial combat, which became known as Bloody April. But the Germans were unable to gain complete supremacy in the skies, and British airmen continued to carry out their objectives despite the losses. After the initial advances, the Battle of Arras quickly developed into a battle of attrition as the Germans fought hard to protect their defences. Despite repeated efforts, the Allies again failed to break the German line, and by the end of the fighting on the 16th of May, British and Empire casualties totaled almost 160,000 men. The battle had resulted in the highest daily casualty rate of the war. And in the age of mechanized warfare, death for so many arrived unannounced, leaving lifeless bodies frozen in time.
There was a big log of wood, And there was 3 soldiers sitting there with their hands on the top of the rifles. I got the eyes closed and I thought, fancy sleeping through all this lot, you know. Anyway, the next day they were still there. A flash from a gun must have killed them outright in seconds. And nobody had moved them at all. They sat there.
Meanwhile, the French offensive on the Aisne had ended in catastrophe as mutiny spread through the ranks. On the 27th of May, 30,000 French troops left the front line and refused to fight on. Arrests and executions followed, but the French had lost their appetite for costly large-scale battles. From then on, the burden of responsibility on the Western Front fell to the British. However, in 1917, mutiny wouldn't be confined to the French alone. At Étaples, in northern France, British and Empire troops en route to the front line were forced to pass through a notorious training arena known as the Bull Ring. Both raw recruits and battle-weary veterans were subjected to a strict and punitive training regime, so harsh many soldiers were only too glad to be sent on to the front. At the end of the summer, over 1,000 British and Empire troops mutinied at Étaples after heavy-handed action by the military police led to the accidental shooting of a Scottish soldier. The ringleader of the mutiny was later executed by firing squad. Andrew Bowie passed through the Bull Ring on his way to the front after recovering from trench foot.
This squadron of about a dozen men came along, and there was a man in the middle. I can see his face now, really. And he had that look on his face and no hat on. And these men were around him, like marching. He was in the middle. And I asked this chap, I said, what are they doing? Oh, I said, taking that fellow away to be shot. Like that, and I just about collapsed, just like that.
During the Great War, 306 British soldiers were executed by firing squad, mostly for cowardice or desertion. It was a sobering thought for soldiers newly posted to the front, like young conscript Harry Patch.
Well, you always had that in the back of your mind that if you were caught sleeping or refused to go over the top, well, then you knew what was coming. The fear of that drove a good many soldiers over the top. Yeah.
At least half of those executed served in the Ypres salient, and it was here that General Haig turned his attention in the summer of 1917. Already the site of 2 major battles, Haig was convinced that a breakthrough at Ypres would lead to the collapse of the German army. The battle that followed has become synonymous with slaughter and sacrifice, endured in the most appalling conditions. Today, it's known simply as Passchendaele. The village of Passchendaele lay northeast of Ypres in Belgian Flanders. It was significant as it was positioned at the head of a series of natural ridges which rose gently above the otherwise flat landscape, giving the occupying German army an unbroken panorama of the surrounding area. Each of these ridges would have to be captured for the British to advance. German defences in the region were widespread and forbidding. Countless streams and canals crisscrossed the low-lying fields of Flanders, and the ground was often too wet for trenches. In their place, the Germans constructed fortifications above ground, together with a network of mutually supporting pillboxes, from which machine gun crews could strafe attackers with impunity. And from the high ground, artillery posts could rain shells down onto advancing infantry with devastating effect. Amongst those about to face these impregnable defences was Harry Patch, who had been assigned to a Lewis gun section. Thrown into action for the first time, Harry and his team quickly formed a very close bond.
You were a team, and that was it. You were with them night and day. You shared everything with them, and you talked about everything. You could say it was more of a love than a comradeship, in a way.
And as he moved up into the front lines, Harry needed all the support he could get. He was, after all, an unwilling conscript with no desire to fight.
And if any man tells you he ever went to France and went in the front line and tell you he wasn't scared, then he's a damn liar. I think every man that went in the front line at some time or another was scared. I know I was. And I know when it came to the point when we went into action, really, I was scared stiff, because I thought the first time over the top, you don't know how you're long going to live. That's it.
The battle for Passchendaele began on the 31st of July 1917. Although it was summertime, heavy rain combined with the 4.5 million shells fired by the Allies in their preliminary bombardment had turned the landscape into a quagmire. Roads disappeared and deep shell holes filled with water, making much of the battlefield almost impassable.
The conditions were hopeless. The mud was almost ankle deep. And if you dropped down with your rifle, you'd find out your rifle was useless with mud. It was no joke. That is the worst position I'd ever been in. You couldn't walk for mud. The whole situation looked hopeless.
On the 16th of August, Harry Patch and his colleagues made their way towards the village of Longmark, one of several objectives that lay between the Allies and Passchendaele. Engineers had worked unceasingly to lay makeshift roads across the swampland, but countless soldiers drowned after falling into mud-filled shell holes.
We were always told that when we were going up or coming back, if a fellow fell into a shell hole which had filled with water, leave him there. Because it was liquid mud. If you tried to get him out, you'd go in yourself, and that was it. And some of those shell holes were 10, 20 feet deep, and they were just mud at the bottom. And if a fellow slipped and went in, well, that was it.
While he was on night duty, Fred Taylor saw a vision so terrifying it seemed like the stuff of nightmares.
I was on duty, and as I got to the last gun, I happened to look. It's just in front of me there, and there was a face in the mud. And when I looked, it seemed as though it laughed at me, and which was rather scary. And although I realised afterwards, a wisp of cloud passed over the moon, which made it look as though the poor devil in the shell hole laughed. I said, but so I made a complaint about it. So the next day they came along and took him away. But it was a bit scary at the time to just see a face in the water as though it laughs at you.
Transporting heavy guns in these conditions pushed artillery crews to the limit.
We've taken them in there, and I remember one place we taken them into, and the guns themselves sank up to the top of the wheels, so we had to get them out by hand.
And it wasn't only the guns that became stuck. Alfred's artillery team also lost horses that sank in the mud.
I mean, they're weighty things, weighty animals, and as fast as you shoveled it away, the mud would come back again, you see. And they used to have to stand in it all night, right up to the bellies sometimes. When they couldn't get out, an officer would come along with his revolver and shoot it. They wouldn't be bothered trying to get it out. Well, you would be upset if you saw a nice animal being shot just through no fault of its own.
The village of Longmark fell on the 16th of August, but Allied casualties were enormous. By the end of the month, they would total almost 68,000 men. As his battalion prepared for the next attack, Andrew Bowie realised their chances of survival were diminishing by the day.
Yes, I think there was a atmosphere of nervousness went through the whole company, really. They felt that, will this be the last time? You know, you've always had that in mind. It didn't matter how strong I think you were. You say, well, this might be the last time, but you wouldn't show it to be something to yourself. You'd feel as you're a weakling if you showed fear. If you started to weep or something like that. I didn't find anybody doing that, but you could tell that there was that anxiety in the air, what was going to happen after daylight tomorrow.
You were all the time, more or less, or at least I was, all the time more or less scared. It gets dark tonight, okay, everything may be quiet. Are you going to see the sun come up in the morning? And when the sun comes in the morning, wonder if I should see it set at night. And that was the feeling you had. At least it was a feeling that I had the whole of the time I was out there. You were living on borrowed time.
And for Harry Patch, that time was quickly running out. As September arrived, the heavy rain at last subsided. Bright sunshine now sucked the moisture from the ground, and in many places clouds of dust filled the air. The push towards Passchendaele continued, and on the 20th of September, the Allies launched their next attack on the Menin Road Ridge. After another huge bombardment, German pillboxes were attacked at close quarters, and Lewis gun teams had great success breaking through enemy defences. However, in places the fighting was so intense it was difficult to get a clear aim.
If we had had a clearer view, we'll say, of half a dozen Germans coming out to join in the fray, well, then we'd have given them half a dozen rounds. That was our job. But they were so close together that if you fired three, you would have had one of our fellows.
On the 22nd of September, Harry Patch and his crew left the front line and were making their way across open ground when they were hit by a random shell.
Well, the whiz-bang came over. I saw the flash. You don't hear any sound from it. You simply see the flash. And it must have been the force of the explosion that blew me down. I didn't know I'd been hit until some minutes after. Where I was hit, all the feeling went out. It was as if the nerves were gone, and it was several minutes before the pain came back, and then I could see the blood. They put the, got a bandage out, put it on it, but the other fellows, they must have been right back where the shell burst, really, and they must have been blown to pieces with it. But they never found anything of them.
For Harry, the war was over, and he was returned to England to recover. But for Andrew Bowie, the worst was yet to come. The battle for Passchendaele itself. At 5:20 a.m. on the 12th of October, Andrew Bowie and his battalion went over the top to attack the village of Passchendaele. By that time, the onset of heavy autumn rain, combined with the constant shelling, had turned the surrounding countryside back into a muddy swamp. As the men lurched forward through the mire, they faced a maelstrom of machine gun bullets and shrapnel, fired from pillboxes and artillery positions.
When it came to attack, the whole hell was let loose by the Germans. The shrapnel machine guns playing on us. We hadn't a chance. It was suicides, really. They just blasted off there. Men were dropping all around us.
Pinned down by the enemy, Andrew spent the entire day cowering in a shell hole as bullets and shrapnel whizzed above him. He was lucky to survive. In that day alone, the Allies suffered some 13,000 casualties. For Andrew's battalion, the losses were devastating.
The whole affair seemed to be over in hours. The battalion just wiped out. The actual roll call after the affair was 39 out of over 600, 680 approximately. So many were killed, of course. So many were wounded and couldn't get out, probably die in the mud.
The village of Passchendaele was finally captured by Canadian troops on the 10th of November. By the end of the battle, 300,000 Allied soldiers had been killed or wounded. Over 40,000 were never found, their bodies blown apart by shell fire or lost forever in the Flanders mud. Passchendaele was the last battle of attrition fought in the Great War. Whether or not the sacrifice was justified remains a matter of debate. But what is certain is that when the Germans launched their spring offensive in 1918, all the ground captured by the Allies was lost. And for Andrew Bowie, there would be one final horror to face before his war came to an end. In 1917, the German army unleashed another horror onto the battlefields of Flanders: mustard gas. It wasn't the first time gas had been used during the Great War. At Ypres in 1915, the Germans used chlorine gas for the first time to devastating effect. But countermeasures like gas masks were quickly introduced, and chlorine's effectiveness as a weapon of mass destruction soon diminished. Mustard gas was far more terrifying. After being launched in shells, this deadly toxin could remain in the environment for weeks, and any contact with skin or tissue caused terrible blisters, breathing difficulties, and blindness. The worst affected died in agony days later. 20-year-old Andrew Bowie was gassed shortly after the Battle of Passchendaele. The effects stayed with him for the rest of his life.
Closes your eyes to begin with, and it chokes you. That's the first effect you feel. You feel choking. Your throat's got it, and you can't breathe very well. And you try to vomit, that's another thing. That's the main symptoms of being gassed. And anything else that's moist will get it. It clings to it. So from there on, you're a real victim of it.
You can't do anything about it. And it seems to bore its way into you, down your throat. You try to vomit. That's a horrible feeling. You vomit and there's nothing to vomit. You just lean forward and try to draw it up from your inside. Try to draw the poison out. You think it says it, but nothing comes up. I had to go to get medical attention, and when I got there were about 20 or more there, all the same, lying on the ground screaming, some of them shouting.
Andrew was sent home to recover, but was told by doctors that his lungs had been so badly damaged he would be dead within 5 years. He lived to be 104 years old. For some of those who had knowingly killed the enemy during the terrible fighting of 1917, there remained a feeling of remorse. Airman Bill Hall was concerned that he might have killed innocent civilians during bombing raids over Germany.
Because I was a churchman, I had a word with a clergyman. I said, there's one thing that does worry me. If we're doing a raid on a Sunday night, when I knew the people in the church, and I knew it was possible I was killing them, I didn't like that. And he said, no, you can reassure yourself there. You're doing your duty. He said, anything like that happens is most unfortunate. So he tried to reassure me not to worry. But that's the only really thought I gave out there. I never thought about the people in the factories who were bombing the factories, never thought of that. Always thought that I'm bombing the something which was going to help Britain.
Others, like Alfred Henn, were left with nothing but a feeling of anger, as they considered the terrible battles of 1917 to have been a worthless sacrifice.
Now, I was angry out because I thought it was unnecessary. It could have been settled by generals or anybody before it started. That's how I think of it today. It's all a lot of nonsense. It doesn't solve anything. It's wicked. I wouldn't volunteer again to do it. They'd have to call me up and do something, I don't know. We thought it was going to be a lovely little game, you know, but it wasn't. It was wicked. Wicked. Sacrifice of young lives for nothing.
Harry Patch is the last surviving British soldier to have fought in the trenches in the Great War. For over 90 years, his thoughts have drifted back to the 22nd of September 1917, the day when a German shell took the lives of 3 of his best friends.
I should never forget the 3 I lost behind me. That upsets me more than anything. We were a team together, and that was it. We were 5 of us in the team. We lost 3 of them. September the 22nd. That is my Remembrance Day, not Armistice Day. Cenotaph service is all right. The rest of it is simply a military show to me.
In a remarkable exercise spanning 15 years, the last survivors of the Great War were interviewed on film. These are unique stories of courage, sacrifice, and tragedy, told by the men and women who were there. These extraordinary interviews have been brought together for the first time. In this film, we hear from the families left behind when fathers, husbands, and brothers went to war. During the 4.5 years of fighting, those on the home front lived with the fear of Zeppelin raids, starvation, and the arrival of the telegram bearing the dreaded words, "Killed in action."
We used to sing the song, "Keep the home fires burning. There's a silver lining through the dark cloud shining. Turn the dark cloud inside out till the boys come home." And my mother always at the end of it said, but some of them will never come home, you see.
I couldn't really imagine him not being there. I thought maybe one day they'll find out they made a mistake, and perhaps he might turn up one day. And even over the years, when people did turn up, I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful if it was Ted?
These are the last voices of World War I. It was harvest time when Britain found herself at war with Germany in August 1914. To begin with, war seemed a glorious adventure to the 1 million men who volunteered to take up arms, and to the families they left behind. Government war propaganda reached even the smallest villages, which were emptied of young men eager to exchange life on the farm for the glamour of life in uniform. Len Whitehead was 7 when his brother George joined the 9th Battalion of the Essex Regiment.
Everybody terribly excited. Nobody more excited than my elder brother, George. He was so keen to go. He went into my mother's bedroom. She was not very well at the time and was in bed. And he picked up a stick, tucked it under his arm and marched about the bedroom. "This is how I shall strut about the London parks," he said. Jokingly, of course. And we sang him the little song. "No more will I work in the harvest field to reap the golden corn, but I'm going to join the army and I'm off tomorrow morn." I don't think it occurred to any of them that they might never come back again. It was a sort of glamour of it all. But he did go, and we watched him out of sight with a sort of parcel tucked under his arm with his towel and shaving gear and that sort of thing. Yes, he went.
Civic pride meant that towns and cities competed with one another to attract the most recruits, and new so-called PALS battalions were made up of men from the same street, factory or football team. Being amongst the first wave to volunteer for Lord Kitchener's army was seen as a badge of honour and manhood, and Kathleen Barron felt proud when her elder brother Dick joined up in 1914.
I looked up to him for everything, because I was sure he'd give me the right answer. And just how it was when you're very young, you think your brother's wonderful. And he looked wonderful. He was very handsome. So, poor little me adored him. To see him go was heartbreaking. But, yeah, he had to go.
It didn't take long for the war to come to Britain. As the British Expeditionary Force set sail for the front in 1914, Parks and gardens across the country were transformed into training grounds for the new recruits of Kitchener's Volunteer Army. It was the first glimpse many on the home front had of the brutality of warfare.
We saw these boys, and they were all sticking bayonets into sacks of straw on the trees where children used to play. And they were running towards them and told just whereabouts in the sack that bayonet had to go. So then we knew what that was.
Many of the young men who joined up to fight had to face the heartache of saying goodbye to their girlfriends. In Liverpool, Florence Billington's sweetheart, Ted, had joined the army before the outbreak of war. But as the date of his departure to France loomed nearer, he began to have serious regrets.
He was worried to death, and I was trying to comfort him. I didn't know what to say. I knew nothing about war or anything like that, but all I could do was to tell him to look on the bright side, that there were better days in store when it was all over, but he was quite convinced that he was going to be killed. We were desperately in love with each other, and we made that promise that as soon as the war was over, which was about Christmas, we'd get engaged. It was a promise, and that was it. So that was a promise he went away with in his heart, that it wouldn't be for long.
But it wasn't only single men who volunteered to fight. And for children whose fathers went off to war, it was an especially worrying time. Ruth Armstrong grew up in the village of Tilshead in Wiltshire.
My father said to my mother, "Oh, I've got to go. My group is caught up, and I've got to go. I've got to go tomorrow." And of course, she was very, very upset. And us two children are all well. The end of the world had come for us with Daddy gone. Well, I miss my dad so much. I used to cry every night for him. And I used to say a little prayer and ask God to send him back.
10-year-old Lucy Walter from Kidderminster never forgot the moment when her father wished her a last goodbye.
In the evening, my father said, "I've got to go back now, back to Kidderminster, back to the barracks. And will you walk with me a little way just up the hill? Will you come with me?" And of course I would. We went off down the road and then up this hill. And I was held onto his hand so tight, I can remember that. And when we got to the top, he said, "No, I won't take you any further. You must go back now." And he picked me up against him and put his arm, held me tight to him, and he kissed me. And he put me down, and he said, "Well, you must go now. Wave to me at the bottom, won't you?" And I went. I left him there, standing there, and I went down the hill, and I kept looking back, and he was still there. And I got to the bottom, and then I got to turn off to go to where we lived. And I stopped and waved to him, and he waved back. And he gestured like that, as much as, "Go on, you must go home now," sort of thing, you know, gently like that. And then he waved.
With families across the country now separated, there followed an anxious wait as Britain's men went to war. Some would never see their homes and loved ones again. By the spring of 1915, it was clear that Kitchener's men were needed in France without delay, and final preparations were made for their departure. Living close to Salisbury Plain in Wiltshire, Ruth Armstrong heard the Artillery Corps fine-tuning their skills for the battles ahead.
We used to get the guns firing over the village, and it was really terrible because the house used to shake, and that was practicing, of course. And the policeman used to come around on his bike, knock at the doors, and he would say, "Well, missus, open your windows a bit tonight. There's going to be a bit of fun tonight." And of course they fired right over the village. You could hear them whiz over the village. Under the bed my brother used to get. I used to get under the pillows. Used to really shake the houses.
But there was soon a far more frightening vision appearing in the skies above Wiltshire: the Zeppelin. The first air raid on Britain took place on the 19th of January 1915, when 2 Zeppelins dropped bombs on Great Yarmouth, killing 4 civilians. A further 19 raids took place that year, causing widespread damage and claiming 181 lives.
One evening, it was not all that dark. We were sitting indoors playing games on the table, snakes and ladders and all that sort of thing. And we heard a lot of screaming, and we all run out. "Oh, there's a Zeppelin coming. Oh, Kaiser's coming." Everybody got out in the road screaming, and they didn't know what to make of it. And my brother got all worried about it, and he said, "Oh, old Kaiser's going to jump out of that Zeppelin and take the lot of us. What are we going to do?" And then my little friend said, "We ought to go and get the policeman." I said, "What can the policeman do?" I said that if the Kaiser comes down, he'll take the policeman as well. And my mother got a bit worried herself, I think, so she said, "The Germans will never have you. They will never have you." She said, "We're not going to live under German rule. No way." She said, so I said, "Well, what will you do, Mummy?" Well, she said, "It's an awful thing to tell you, but she said I should wait till you're asleep, and I should put your pillow over your head, and then I should do the same to myself. The Germans are not going to rule me, nor my children."
To begin with, Britain's air defences were weak, and few Zeppelins were shot down. When they were, there was little sympathy for the crew on board.
It was like a long silver pencil, all on fire, right up in the sky. And the neighbours was hooraying, and Germans, you know. I said, "But they're men burning alive." All I could think of, they were burning alive. And I rushed indoors. I couldn't stand it.
This propaganda film recreated the destructive power of the airship, the indiscriminate nature of their bombs earning them the nickname the Baby Killers. They were scenes familiar to 10-year-old Madge Main-Donald, who was caught in an air raid in London.
It was the people screaming that got me down. 1 or 2 had lost their child or their partner or something, and they were calling and trying to find each other, and everybody was laying on the floor. We weren't standing up, and people were trying to, and calling, "John, John, where are you, John? Oh, for Christ's sake, John, speak to me," and things like that, and I'm praying, "Please, God." Well, I couldn't see the sense of that. I really couldn't see the sense of that.
There were only a few safe air raid shelters and little protection for civilians, yet after the initial panic, the reaction to the raids was one of fierce resistance. The random killing of women and children was a propaganda gift which helped strengthen national unity. After most raids, it was business as usual, and all feelings of fear were suppressed, even amongst the children.
We got up in the morning, and I went to school, and I got late, because we'd only had about half an hour's sleep. I got told off for being late, which was very unusual, because I was a very punctual child. And I never said a word. And I couldn't talk about it.
Back on the Western Front, in the autumn of 1915, the Allies launched their first major attempt to break through the German lines near the French coal mining town of Loos. It was the first real test for Kitchener's volunteers. It was here that Len Whitehead's elder brother George went over the top. His body was never found.
The first we knew of it, of his being killed, was a pal of his who joined up at much the same time, wrote to my mother, "Dear Mrs. Whitehead, I am writing to tell you your son George has been killed." My mother, of course, burst into tears. "Don't read any more," she said. And after a time, when she calmed down a little, she said to me, "Go and tell your father." My father was ploughing in a field near to the farmhouse, and I waited for him to finish about with his plough and 2 horses. "George has been killed," I told him. And he didn't answer, but left his horses all steaming in the mild late October weather, and we walked back in silence to the house. When we got to the house, he went to the bottom of the stairs and called up, "That's all right, ain't it?" He made no attempt to go up to comfort my mother, but went into the kitchen, sat in his wooden armchair and put his arms on the table and his head on his arms for a little while, wept, I think. Then he went back to his ploughing.
The Battle of Lewes had been a failure, and British casualties totalled around 20,000 men. But it was just a foretaste of things to come. With so many men away at the front, women began to enter the workforce in large numbers, often having to do the jobs previously undertaken by skilled and semi-skilled men. By 1917, 1 million women were doing what had once been men's jobs in the munitions factories. To begin with, Daisy Collingwood was keen to do her patriotic duty.
I felt when I was working on munitions, I really thought, well, I haven't got any brothers to go and fight, I'm doing the next best thing, and I was quite pleased to be able to do it.
The pressure to meet production targets meant that 12-hour shifts day and night were common.
I had never stayed up all night in my life when I started on night work. I never thought I'd get through that shift. But I did. Like everything else, it's surprising what you can do when you've got to.
But the health and welfare of the women was often sacrificed in the production drive. Around 1,000 munitions workers would die, many of them in factory explosions, like this one at Silvertown in London's East End. Daisy Collingwood was a lucky survivor, but was so mentally distressed she was unable to continue working.
It was as though the whole world shook with the noise of the explosion. I've never heard a noise like it. But of course, not only me, all those working in the building were all shot around. The place was just a shambles.
To make ends meet, many families began to send their young children out to work to help pay for the food essential to their survival. Over 500,000 were withdrawn early from school to be used as child labour. At the age of 9, Dennis Gilfeather began work in the Dundee jute mills.
We're starting at 6 in the morning until 6 at night. You had 2 breaks through the day, 9 to 10 and 1 to 2. And it was 5.5 days. You worked 54 hours a week and you got £1 and a penny. But that was gold in these days. I was a very, very proud boy when I got my pay and took it home to my mum. I knew it would make her happy, and it certainly made me very happy.
and I felt I was 6 feet tall instead of 5 feet 6.
Children who remained in school were also expected to do their bit for the war effort. In Wiltshire, Ruth Armstrong's teacher encouraged her pupils to take up knitting for the cause.
We made scarves and balaclavas and socks and gloves. I'd done scarves because I wasn't much of a hand at knitting. And then she wanted us to write to the soldiers out in the front, you know, and to cheer them up. And I got an answer from one of them, and he told me, he said how very happy he was to get my letter, and he hadn't had a letter from anyone for 6 weeks, and he had this letter from me and how it cheered him up.
In 1916, 14-year-old Kathleen Barron began work as a pianist in her local cinema, accompanying newsreels as they flickered on the silver screen above her.
I so loved playing the piano. I got this job, much to my amazement, and it was the silent films, of course, and all the different films about the war, and I had to play accordingly. I was told that I had a lot of expression in my playing, which is touch, gentle touch, and yet firmness of the fingers. And according to what was on, so I would look and play just from my mind, no music, what that would coincide with that film. If it was bombing, a terrible fight, I would know what sort of music to play.
Kathleen couldn't have known it, but she would soon be playing along with some of the most remarkable images ever captured on film. On the 1st of July 1916, the Battle of the Somme began. The government was so confident of victory, it allowed cameramen to film the troops in action. 20 million would watch these scenes of trench warfare, some real, some reconstructed, in cinemas all over Britain. For the first time, families back home glimpsed the horrors of trench warfare.
It almost seemed unreal to me. You know, it couldn't be going on. But of course it was. And the terror of it affected me. And yet I could feel the sadness and the horror from the audience. You could feel it.
The battle raged on until the end of November. In 5 months of fighting, over 600,000 British and Allied soldiers were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. In towns and villages that had raised PALS battalions, the effects were devastating. Entire communities went into mourning as across the country, the dreaded telegram was delivered with an ever-increasing regularity. By the winter of 1916, the spirit of patriotism that had once gripped the country had all but disappeared. The losses on the Somme had shocked the nation, and every day those at home lived in fear of the arrival of an official letter or telegram bearing bad news.
People used to dread seeing the little telegraph boys come on the bikes. It was nearly always to say that somebody had been killed. It made you afraid of that telegraph boy coming to the door. You didn't want to see him. You were hoping he'd keep away. You didn't want him because he always had bad news.
In Liverpool, Kathleen Barron and her family waited nervously for news about her brother Dick.
In those days, the postman knocked on the door, and my mother used to say, "Go and fetch the letters," which I did. And if there was one that was a buff colour and it had on His Majesty's Service on it, my mother couldn't open she couldn't open the letters. And she used to say, "You open them, you open them." So I had to open them.
The letter most feared was Army Form B10482. It contained the blunt message, "Killed in action," and was now being received by tens of thousands of families. Dennis Gilfeather's father was killed in France, fighting with the King's Own Scottish borderers.
When this happened, when the official news came through the door, my mother had the wee boy in a high chair, and we were round the table, and she was attending to us. When the telegram boy came, Mother went to the door and she got this telegram. She'd opened it, looked at it, collapsed on the floor. And the eldest boy said, "Get through to Mrs. Lawson and get her." So this was a neighbour. I had knocked on her door and she come out, and she says, "What's the matter, son?" I said, "My mum's collapsed." And when she came through and she attended my mother and washed her face, gave her a cup of tea. And then suddenly the news was out now. The news that my father wasn't going to see him again. You're stuck with that. This thing didn't leave your mind for years. You're not going to see your dad again.
It was very difficult for those back home to come to terms with the sudden loss, with no body to bury and little or no information on the circumstances of death.
The postman brought a letter, and my mother opened it, and she sat there, and all she said was, "Oh, he's dead." And then she did begin to cry. I don't remember crying. I felt so stunned, I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that I'd never see him again. But oh dear, I did cry at night, because I remembered my father. Always tucked me up and he always kissed my forehead and said, "Good night, Lulu, God bless you." Every night, he never failed. And I did miss that so much. I really did. I suppose in a way I was heartbroken. I was.
By 1917, the main German strategy to win the war was through a naval blockade, sinking the Allied merchant fleet and starving Britain into submission. In just 1 month, German U-boats destroyed 371 merchant ships bringing food to Britain. With 2/3 of the country's food supply coming from overseas, there would soon be a crisis on the home front.
The only time we had a meal really was on the Sunday, when we used to have a dinner on a Sunday. That was practically the only real meal we had in the week. And the bread was black, almost black. Couldn't get white bread, never. And there wasn't much of anything. And people starved. Did you know people starved? If you were hungry, you didn't tell anybody, you didn't go begging. Why would you? People didn't, they had their pride. I wouldn't have told anybody I was hungry.
My mother, I don't know how she managed. We were starving. If the war went on another 4 months, I don't know what would have happened. My mother, she was done everything she can for both of us, my little brother and me. She'd done everything she could. It was nothing to see her sit at the table with an empty plate. "Mummy, you're not eating." "Well, I'm not hungry." Whatever she had was for my brother and myself. And my mother and grandmother used to go out in the fields, with the permission of the farmers, of course, and pick the greens off the turnips and the swedes, take them home and cook them with potatoes and mash it up with margarine. That was our Sunday dinner. Mother used to say, eat it up and imagine that you're having a nice roast dinner. And we made ourselves believe it. And it went down good because we were hungry.
A production drive in the countryside was desperately needed to help make the country more self-sufficient in food. But many of the young farm workers had been amongst the first wave of volunteers to go to the front, and with them had gone most of the horses of rural England, now being commandeered for service by the army.
When they took the horses, it upset me very much. We only had 4. 2 of them were beautiful Shire-type horses. They took those and another bay mare which wasn't quite as big. Left us just with 1 horse. Meant an awful lot to us, the horses. Boxer, Duke and Violet were their names. Never saw them again, of course.
According to government propaganda and popular legend, the Women's Land Army helped overcome the food production crisis as middle-class volunteers gave up their comfortable suburban lives to work on the farms. In fact, few were prepared to make the sacrifice, and even fewer farmers wanted them. They were still only 16,000 strong by the end of the war, and they made little impact. But alongside them came a fresh supply of manpower, the Army Agricultural Labour Corps, many of whom were disabled ex-soldiers, like 19-year-old George Louth from Hampshire. George had fought in the Battle of the Somme and was sent home from the trenches, suffering from partial deafness and nervous exhaustion.
I didn't know how a potato grew, never mind about haymaking. And we went to this farm, and we was there a fortnight. And he sent us back. Said we were no good. So the officer said to me, well, look, he said, if you can't do anything on the land, it's no good you stopping here. You'll have to go back to France again. I said, oh no. I said, is there some tractor drivers being wanted somewhere? Is that what you want to do? I said, yes, sir.
At least George had now escaped the nightmare of trench warfare.
I felt free, didn't I, after all that trauma? It disappeared. It disappeared altogether. As though it was yesterday.
1917 saw some of the bitterest fighting of the war, and the dreadful battles of Arras and Passchendaele have since become synonymous with suffering on an unimaginable scale. As the war dragged on, the tragic news of losses continued to reach people across the land. Before he left for the front, Florence Billington's sweetheart, Ted, had promised they would get engaged at the end of the war. It was a promise he would be unable to keep.
I was working at the Palace Hotel, Buxton, and one of the porters came up with this letter from the War Office, official looking. When I saw it, my heart sank a little bit. I thought it must be something very, very important. And when I opened it, it was to say that they regretted to tell me that Edward had been killed. The letters from me were found on his body, and that's why they could find out where I was. I couldn't really I couldn't really imagine him not being there. I couldn't imagine it. I thought maybe one day they'll find out they made a mistake, and perhaps he might turn up one day.
Grief could have a devastating physical impact on women who were already weakened by overwork and starvation. A contemporary survey found that 1 in 8 war widows died within a year of their soldier husbands. 6 months after losing her husband, Dennis Gilfeather's mother was seriously ill in hospital.
You think that the whole world's changing, the sunshine's leaving your life. Your mother's in bed and she's very ill. As she's now, you can't go, Mum. You must, you know, all love you so much. And she looked at me and she said, you look after them. If anything happens to me, you look after the bairn and Dan. I was the 2 youngest. You've been graded up and you have to stay strong. But your stomach was tumbling with nerves and the worry in case you lost your mum.
Dennis was lucky. His mother survived, and the extra money he earned working in the jute mills helped to keep his family together. By 1918, the war had entered its final phase. The German offensive of the spring had failed, and the Allies were now pushing towards victory. At home, the introduction of rationing and one of the best harvests for years had helped quell the food shortages. 4 years of suffering and privation were at last coming to an end. But for many on the home front, the end of the war was just the beginning of a new and unexpected chapter in their lives. In November 1918, the guns on the fields of Flanders at last fell silent, and across Britain, crowds turned out onto the streets to mark the occasion. But for the families of the 750,000 British men killed in the fighting, there was little to celebrate. Len Whitehead's older brother George had been killed in 1915.
My mother was very sad. She didn't want to take part in any celebrations or anything like that. We didn't hear the armistice had been signed until very late in the afternoon. We were isolated on a farm, you see. But my mother didn't take any part in any celebrations. One of her precious family wasn't coming home. And it made her sad, of course. You see, we used to sing the song, "Keep the Home Fires Burning." Everybody's heard that, of course. Keep the home fires burning while the hearts are yearning. Though the lads are far away, they dream of home. There's a silver lining through the dark cloud shining. Turn the dark cloud inside out till the boys come home. And then my mother always finished up, but some of the poor boys won't ever come home. And so it was always there, the fact that he would not come home again.
Kathleen Barron's brother Dick was one of those lucky enough to make it home. Although it would take him many years to recover from a case of severe dysentery that had nearly killed him.
I would pray, quite believing that God would bring him back. And he did. Of course, he came back very ill, terribly ill. But he came back. I've never seen my mother look so beautiful as she did when she saw her son. It was the elation, the lovely feeling of seeing him. She really did. I couldn't believe it. She looked so lovely. He wasn't quite the, what shall I say, happy-go-lucky, fun-loving person that he was. You see, he'd altered. I mean, he'd suffered a lot, nearly died, and that alters people, doesn't it? because he wasn't really quite well, even then. Far from well, really. But there you are, we had him back. We had him home.
After her sweetheart Ted was killed earlier in the war, Florence Billington married a sailor called Sid. But she never forgot Ted and the promise that he was unable to keep, that he would come home and marry her after the war.
Couldn't settle down, thinking of him. That's what it was. It made me all unsettled. I made up my mind that one day I would go over there and try to find the place where he'd fallen, which I did. I didn't find a place where I saw the memorial there and his name and everything, but I thought about him a lot, and he came to me several times in spirit. Yes, told me he thought he kept thinking of me, and he loved me with all his heart, and that was the one thing he didn't like to leave me when he went. But he did. He came back a few times and has done over the years. So that's how it is.
For many fathers returning home to their families, it was a wonderful occasion, tinged only with the sadness that they had missed the joys of watching their children grow up. But some could never readjust to the normality of family life.
My father and mother was never the same again. And it happened to so many families. After my father had been home some little time, things seemed to, I don't know, go funny between my father and mother. And I found out afterwards that he had been accusing her of carrying on the soldier. And a New Zealander, he reckoned it was, because we were surrounded with New Zealanders. And he found this letter, you see. Dear Kitty, I'm so sorry I haven't seen you lately, but I still got the children's comics for them. Hope to see you soon. Lots of love, Con. Of course, she got in an awful temper about it because she told him straight she, was a lot of lies. But he wouldn't listen. He got it in his head, and he was a changed man. And what he wanted to do was clear out and take me. And he wanted to, anyway, in the end they parted. And I broke my heart. Oh, I broke my heart.
After being sent home from the trenches with partial deafness and nervous exhaustion, George Louth spent the remainder of the war working on the land in Dorset. There he met Ella, the daughter of his landlady, and after an 8-month courtship, George proposed.
I said, will you marry me? She was shook. So then we decided, when we went indoors, and we gave the news to the mother-in-law, and she clapped. She clapped because she never had a son-in-law like that before.
George and Ella married on Armistice Day, November the 11th, 1918.
Got married, and as we came out of that Blandford, we see all the flags flying. We thought it was for us. And it wasn't. It was Armistice Day, 11 o'clock. But we got married. And we done it now. We did that then, married for 70 years.
The hunger and hardship on the home front will always be overshadowed by the far greater suffering and death of soldiers on the front line. But for those who lived through it, the devastating impact the war had on the family life of the nation will never be forgotten. life.